So the starting point, the premise is technological change is not enough. Lifestyles also need to change, but change which is fun is more likely to happen. And we have two candidates for a low carbon, high fun economy: high-tech digitalization and dematerialization. Let's throw all the innovation we can at it. Or slow living, live better, consume less. The more of the slow living, localized society based on crafts, culture, and caring. Now, I don't know how many people in the audience have ever tried to plot fun against carbon, but here we go. So this is business as usual. Now, business as usual, it might be fun for a while, but it might get nasty. It might just lead to a story of collapse. Here we have hair shirt policies. Well, they're certainly not going to be fun, but they might deliver the goods. Or we've got the slow living one, which is more the local-based society. Now, that might be a load more fun, but as anyone who's read Prosperity Without Growth will have realized, devising the right economics for that one is really challenging. Or we've got the high-tech scenario, which might actually be great fun, but we don't know how far it can get us. Can it really deliver the goods? So the guiding questions for our research: which technologies require less stuff and deliver more fun, and which lifestyles require less stuff and deliver more fun? So which is more effective, our high-tech digitalization, dematerialization scenario, or slow living, living better, consuming less, a localized society? So we need to look at the relationship between technology, lifestyles, carbon and fun. So what can be learned from the evidence? So this is the carbon footprint of an average UK household. And what we can see is that recreation and leisure pulls through about 27% of the carbon emissions. And that's us having fun. Recreation and leisure, again, these are exactly the same categories in which I've disaggregated travel, and we can see here that travel emissions are responsible for a great deal of the percentage there. And when we look at the entire carbon footprint, we find that travel-related emissions, and that's both direct emissions and embodied emissions, they account for around 27% of the entire household footprint. More evidence looking at the role of employment. This graph shows the greenhouse gases and employment per million US dollars of final demand. So you can see down here, personal and social services. Now these are many of the things that talk to the slow living society. They're high employment and very low greenhouse gas emissions. But unfortunately, you can't get anywhere with them unless you have your utilities, where we see, of course, low employment and high greenhouse gas emissions. Now, employment is important. We need it for our livelihoods, of course, but also what we do is important. And we find that the most satisfying jobs are mostly professions, especially those involving caring for, teaching, and protecting others, and the creative pursuits. How we use our time matters. We only have 24 hours a day. All we can do is shift our activities from one thing to another. We've been looking at the carbon emissions per hour of different activities, and the good news that in general leisure and recreation is good. We see here spending time with friends and family is a good low carbon per hour activity. The moment you bring travel emissions into it, then the category goes into a higher carbon emissions per hour. So what activities make us happy, and how do those activities chime with the carbon intensities? Which of them are low or high carbon per hour? Social activities are things we enjoy. Conversing with friends and family, making love here, but I do need a caveat that without the right precautions it can be very high carbon. Physical activities such as walking, exercise and active sport make us happy, and goal-orientated activities. Now, Csikszentmihalyi talks about flow, and he says flow is a state of effortless concentration and enjoyment when you are completely immersed in an experience, such as singing in a choir, reading a really good book, or skiing downhill. Those are the kind of things that make us happy. Gardening, reading and painting, goal-orientated. Shopping is, of course, a goal-orientated activity. We're out for the catch. We have an aim, but it is, of course, high carbon. Looking at the role of digital technology. Now, how does this help with our low-carbon, high-fun agenda? Well, on the plus side, it gives us broader social networks and remote contact. We get a great deal of entertainment. We get freedom. We get safety and security, perhaps higher growth. On the more negative side, it does stimulate the thirst for consumerism and travel experiences, and as Mark Davis talks about, it has induced the hurried, lonely society. There's a status symbol. Oh, I'm really busy. We're constantly connected to doing more faster, and we've often replaced face-to-face contact, which is one of the things we enjoy, with remote contact, and this has ended up with a lonely society. Perhaps the digital technology is responsible for less sleep and less employment. Localism, as we're talking about in the slow living better, consuming less society, we would have stronger local connections, better integrated work and home lives, more connection to the environment, probably more active lifestyles as we wouldn't be jumping in our cars all the time, less stress, slower, more sleep, perhaps more employment. But on the downside, and these are mostly downsides on the fun or less fun, we'd have shorter, narrower horizons, lots of opportunities, lower life experiences, and perhaps more repressive social mores. Would there be lower social mobility and lower growth? So, what does all this tell us? We have our two candidates of our high-tech, digitalized, dematerialization society and the slow living better, consuming less society. Well, what Tim and I have thought about is that it's really not about the destination here. It's more about the journey. Change, which is more fun, is likely to be more successful. It's more likely to stick. It's less likely to engender disruption. We need to minimize the risk of failure of policies, and we need to maximize carbon reductions, and fun is an important component here. So we need to look at how to balance investment. Low carbon infrastructure, we need to invest in public goods and space. We do need to enhance connectivity. Connectivity is very important when we're talking about the low transport scenarios. We need better local services also. We need to protect our well-being. We need to look at issues of equity. We need democratic participation, and we need what I talked about, this flow and fulfillment and fun. But just before I end, I don't know how much you could see from the back, but when we're looking at carbon activities per hour, there's one easy, quick win, and we really all ought to sleep some more.
Thank you, and thank you for staying for time. That's brilliant. Okay, the next person, William Lamb, from the Tyndall Centre, will talk to us about the transitions in pathways of human development and emissions. Over to you, William.
Okay. So this research is based on work by myself and Julia Steinberger, also Alice Bose and Ruth Wood from the Tyndall Centre in Manchester. So I'd like to talk about low carbon pathways of human development, existing examples of countries, so looking at more of a national level, and in particular focus on why they might be interesting or relevant for us. So this is the first of many graphs. And right, so of course, if we're talking about low carbon pathways, we're interested first of all in carbon emissions per capita here. But more importantly, we're perhaps interested in or concerned with the rate of change in emissions. So the trajectory over the last 10 years are plotted here on the vertical axis. So it's not only sufficient to be low carbon, you also have to have a low trajectory. And we can differentiate further countries if we add in an emissions target, right? So let's, for lack of better information, say an equal per capita target. In a short term, 2020, that equates to about 4 tons of emissions per capita. That's the vertical line here. And of course, associated with that line is a rate of degrowth corresponding to each point in this graph. So in short, we need to move all of these dots, these countries, underneath this line in order to progress towards that emissions target. It's my overall point is that there's 2 sort of distinct types of transitions, right? There's sufficient degrowth, so there's countries that are degrowing their emissions from a high emission state and they're doing it sufficiently to get into that region of the emissions target. And conversely, there are countries that are already at a low carbon state, but they are growing. They're mostly developing countries, and as long as they don't overshoot, they're more or less likely to hit that target. So of course there are more examples of the latter rather than the former. This is Portugal down here. This is the only one that's actually sufficiently degrowing according to this emissions target, and I think this big gap down to about 10%, these are all wealthy countries, is why we're all here. But there are many countries up here, right? So we're interested in first of all understanding if they're socially sustainable as well as sufficient from a climate point of view. And social sustainability, I think most people in this room know that it doesn't equate to economic performance, right? So John Barrett yesterday was talking about a certain threshold of GDP being necessary for a good life, infrastructure and so on, but it's not actually sufficient, as we know. And given that there is a very strong relationship between emissions and GDP at a national level, it follows that if we abandon income maximization as an implicit or explicit policy goal, then there may be some new options for decarbonisation. So we can take life expectancy, for example. This has some relationship to emissions up until a point. So there's a threshold around about here, beyond which there's not really this sort of marginal returns on increasing your emissions. And we can see that in this corner there is a region that we call Goldenberg's Corner, where you have good outcomes, so low emissions and high human development defined by life expectancy. And I suppose we can be skeptical, right? So we can question whether these are really good examples for following some kind of sustainable pathway, because they could in fact just be Caribbean nations with no winter heating loads and service-based economies and loads of hydropower. So I'll keep those countries secret for now. But we can actually explore the underlying drivers of emissions, right? So, or the underlying factors that are associated with high emissions. And for this data set, we use consumption-based emissions, and we found income was, of course, very significant, but so was climate. Exports, so something to do with trade, the ratio of trade in GDP was significant, and as was population growth, so a demographic factor. And in order to explore that, that question of whether they're relevant, we can actually group countries mathematically. So we can look at countries that share these similar underlying drivers, which we did. We came up with 5 groups of countries. These are the high income nations. They tend to have cold winters, they trade a bit. This is mostly the former Soviet Union. And you see we're pushing more towards Goldenberg's Corner now. These are a few Southeast Asian states and Central American states that trade a lot, and they have generally warmer climates. And then we have quite a mixed group of low carbon states in Central and South America and across East Asia and North Africa. So you have really diverse groups coming out of here. And the important point to remember is that when we go back to this criteria of low emissions and high development, that there are in fact many different examples, so they're not all just tropical Caribbean states. We can see that there are 4 out of 5 groups are represented here, and they have various drivers behind them. So some of them are trading, some of them are not, some of them are medium incomes. And but in general we have quite diverse outcomes. And this is relevant not just for these countries, but all of those outside of Goldenberg's corner that may share similar barriers to decarbonisation as those within, and therefore some chance for using those as examples of following a pathway of development. So this is quite sort of high level and fairly abstract, and that's because we're quite early on in the research. But I would say, following on from Angela's talk, that if we do focus on social rather than economic performance, it opens up a whole suite of development decisions and processes in the present and the past that may be worthy of our attention in exploring what a low carbon society might look like. And I've simply talked about life expectancy here, but I think fun is also a very interesting concept that could be explored in a similar manner. But we do see that going back to this graph, that these wealthy nations, they're really in a group of their own, and that while high human development is compatible with climate goals, high national incomes are not. So I would support some kind of economic degrowth strategy for those countries. And most exciting for me is really the question of how radical emissions reductions may affect human development, whether there are indeed co-benefits to doing so, and if we should be exploring more broadly for inspiration. Thank you.
Fantastic. That leaves us with 12 minutes for questions, which is brilliant. We have a hand straight up here. So first question, James, and we'll take 3 questions, I think, and then let the panel decide which ones to answer.
James Mackay from the University of Leeds. This is a question for Angela. I'd just like to ask, what can be done to stop women from shopping?
Fine.
Basically, we've talked about we have an incredibly high consuming society, but there's no male that I know that enjoys shopping. So it's very gender based.
To save you being looted, should we move to the next question? We will have the woman in the aisle. The red scarf, yes. Not in the shopping aisle, I didn't say that.
I didn't want to talk about shopping. My name's Alice Sharp. I'm the director of Invisible Dust, and I work with artists and scientists on climate change ideas. Yesterday, Mike Berners-Lee talked about the importance of creativity and dreaming, and also Naomi Klein talked about the importance of imagining a new society. And I thought, particularly in terms of Angela's presentation, that one of the things that comes through there is the importance of imagination and creativity in understanding how we might live in the future and how we might develop new ways of living in our homes, and maybe some of them might go back to quite old-fashioned ways in terms of creativity and ideas of that kind.
Thank you very much. I'll take one more question, just in front then. There we go. Great, and there'll be another round. Yeah.
Okay. I'm Peter Harper from the Centre for Alternative Technology. It's lovely to hear these presentations, but they're more or less identical to things we were talking about in the early 80s. So I just would like to ask, why has it taken so long to reach the universities?
Who wishes to start? Angela.
I'm going to tackle the women and shopping one. Okay, so can you hear me? Yeah. I set out, in the looking at carbon emissions per hour, it turned out that I could do a gender analysis, and I was desperate to write a paper saying that men are bad and women are good. I was really upset about this one because it came out that the average intensity of men and women is the same in the home, but women's intensity comes out, women's actual carbon footprint, not their intensity, their actual carbon footprint comes out a bit higher than men's. Now this is because men spend less time in the home and women spend more time in the home. But the characteristics of men and women is very different. Men actually have higher emissions due to commuting, whereas women actually are doing a lot of the personal care and childcare and cooking and washing type jobs, which are very carbon intensive per hour. But what did strike us as one of the things is that the nature of time that women and men have is different. And men have a higher intensity on their leisure emissions than women. And this seems to be because men have longer to go out. They go out and they say, I'm going to go play golf, and they're gone for like 4 or 5 hours. Whereas women's time is all like, I've got to feed the children, I've got to collect them from school, I've got to do this, that and the other. So men have higher travel emissions and higher intensity for their leisure than women. I don't like shopping, so I can't comment on the actual shopping, but I thought that would be helpful to have just made sure that men are worse than women, just in case you're in doubt. On the creativity and the imagining a new society, yes, we do need to imagine a new society. And I think it's very important that we're empowered by living the new society. And I was struck by Jonathan Porritt's book, The World We Made. And it's not altogether a world that we particularly want, that I particularly would envisage, but his motivation for writing that book was to show that with technologies that we can envisage now that aren't actually too difficult to think about, we could actually get there. It was his story there. So I recommend that people read that.
Yes.
Shall I?
Do you want to add anything on why?
Why we haven't got, why we're still where we were in the
I'll hand it to you.
1980s. I'm sorry, I haven't been in the academia that long, so I was in industry. So I can't comment on that one. Maybe we should open that to the floor.
I wasn't alive in the early 1980s, so...
Brilliant. Do you have anything to say on any other points, William? Or we'll take another round of questions. Right, we'll have 3 then, and I will get 2 here, Rebecca, and then 2 at the front. Yep. So, yes, just here.
I'm tempted to talk about men and fast cars, but I won't. Question for William. It's really, really interesting the way that you've analysed the countries in that way, and to show that there are some other than the high-income countries who could provide a model. But my question is that surely the countries are in the sectors they are because of, because that's just the way they've evolved, that's the type of country they are. And to what extent could we actually engineer development pathways in that direction? To what extent can it actually be a managed process, and how much is it just, a factor of history?
Thank you. And then at the front here, yes, to the front, and then just behind.
Thanks. Roger Martin, Population Matters. Very glad to hear William mention population growth as a driver of climate change, the first person to do so during this conference. I draw his attention to a couple of papers from 2009 and 10. One, an LSE report that I commissioned, which showed that in terms of the investment needed to abate 1 ton of carbon, investment in family planning, preventing unwanted births of future consumers of carbon at a stroke with a single action lasting a lifetime, was vastly more cheap and efficient, cost-effective than the cheapest renewable technology. I'd also mention, apropos Jonathan Porritt's very interesting book that was just mentioned, The World We Made, which I gave a glowing review to, that he too has a very strong chapter on population that comes up throughout. He's keenly aware that his society is impossible with a growing population, and he's a patron of Population Matters, very active in trying to get the UK and global populations to stabilise as low as possible, because he's as aware as the rest of us who know it, that in a world by 2050, in 36 years' time, where the UN project will be somewhere between 8.4 and 10.9 billion people, a range of 2.5 billion, which is the whole population of the planet when I was 10, quite clearly it's going to be easier to get emissions down at the lower end of that than the higher end. Thank you.
Thank you. And then one more question here, and then we'll get William to respond.
Thank you. Jonathan Porritt's also a supporter of text, by the way, just out of interest. I'm also, in my day job, I work with the Network of Wellbeing, and it's really great to hear these papers directly linking this, what I consider to be this broader wellbeing agenda. So I just think, it's great to put fun in the title, and I think is a useful frame, but I think there's 30 years of research into wellbeing, which is really rigorous, it's evidence-based, and it'd be crazy not to draw on that. I think wellbeing's been mentioned a couple of times, sort of as side comments throughout this conference, and I think it's just something that's really important for us to engage in as we basically moving towards, you know, if we're critiquing growth, we need to sort of provide the better option, which is well-being measures of progress, well-being measures of what we're doing as a society, rather than GDP measures, which clearly don't work. So I think this is a really strong agenda that's a growing one, and one that we really should get on board with. Thanks.
Thank you. William, do you want to start?
Yeah, on the population growth one. So this is actually relatively complicated. So the population growth in our model, it may account for many other factors, right? So in general, you find with lower populations, lower rates of population growth, there's a sort of demographic transition leading to lower household sizes, and that can have knock-on effects on carbon emissions. So that might be what we're seeing. I would doubt that it's actually directly measuring, increasing populations and therefore more carbon emissions, because we are looking at it in per capita terms. But I could maybe talk to you about that further afterwards and maybe give you my paper. To what extent is this all a factor of history? I think that's a really strong question that's going on right now. And I was impressed that Naomi Klein is also linking issues of trade in with international development. And I probably referred to the work of Alf Hornborg and Joan Martinez Alier at Lund University and Barcelona, and they're doing some really interesting stuff on ecologically unequal exchange and how country development is actually a sort of a factor of global development as a whole. So if they're right, then it would definitely be the case that in order to follow pathways such as those I've talked about, then it would need some kind of change to the overall global paradigm. They didn't discuss this, but it could be that they're just lucky in being at a certain level of the hierarchy in the global system. And yeah, I think that's
great. And do you want to tackle the well-being question?
So yes, thank you very much. Yes, of course, we're aware of the literature of 30 years of well-being research, and we were drawing on it. I didn't put my slide of references up. 10 minutes is not long to say much. This is a political challenge. I mean, Bhutan has a national measure of well-being instead of using GDP. How many other countries can you imagine the UK doing that in the next 10, 20 years? They are so fixated on growth and GDP, even though I'm sure the people in the Treasury must understand how perverse it is many times. It's an argument that's been done quite a lot, and there's a lot of literature out there about that as well.
Thank you very much. And we could get back on time, actually, which, oh look, they're looking happy down here. So we'll go with that and move on to the next session, but one last chance to thank our speakers. So,
Medal for being on time.
oh, there we go. Excellent, change over. I thought that worked well, actually.
Yes.
That was a better session.
So let's move on to the last session. We had, in the last two days, we framed the issues, we talked about barriers, we talked about policy options, behavior, lifestyle, how to deliver. And now this last session is kind of trying to bring this together a little bit and to look forward, what are the pathways for the future? So that's a bit how we frame the conference to end here, and then afterwards we have a session of discussion. So I'm pleased to open the session on pathways for radical mitigation with Simon Bullock. Please go forward, from Friends of the Earth, and he will talk about utilizing the DECC 2050 energy pathway to model radical emission reduction and the political limitations of the model.
Okay, thanks very much everybody. I'm Simon from Friends of the Earth. I'm going to talk about DECC's 2050 pathway model, which people have mentioned over the last couple of days. It allows users to look at different ways the UK can meet its 2050 80% target. Perhaps surprisingly for me, you might think the first thing I'd like to do is to congratulate DECC. They've done an absolutely excellent piece of work here, the people working on it as well. It's a comprehensive and clear job, very impressive technical content. The effort they've gone to communicate it to a wide range of different audiences, roadshows up and down the country, really impressive. But perhaps the most impressive thing to me is the transparent way that they've gone about doing it. They've laid open the workings of the model completely. John Broderick and Charlie Baker, I think, have done a good hack job on it on the last week or so. It's really impressive that they've done this. They're also expanding it. They're going to look at pathways for China, a global pathway calculator for biofuels. These are all excellent tools, so hooray for DECC. I think they've done a fantastic job. I can't go without having one go at the government, which is to say it's a stark contrast to the Treasury. The Treasury and HMRC have got a model for looking at how to assess the economic costs and benefits of the fourth carbon budget, and we Freedom of Information requested that from them and they refused to give it. I wonder what they are frightened of. So to DECC's model, it is excellent, but I think there are two main difficulties with it. The first is about the parameters which are set for it by the government, so that's not really DECC's fault. And the other one is about the options within the model. The first one is the parameters, and that's what 2 or 3 people have mentioned. I think Charlie, Chris Shaw, Kevin and John have all mentioned the problems with the 80% target. And that it should not be treated as a given. I think it's very important that we say that and repeat the issue, and there are 3 reasons why it shouldn't be treated as a given. It's too hot. 2 degrees is what the EU and the G8 say the target should be. There are 100 developing countries which say it should be a 1.5 degree target. People like James Hansen have said 1 degree target. 2 degrees is definitely contested. The second thing is that the Committee on Climate Change, 2 degrees is obviously uncertain. They've set carbon budgets based on, I think it's a 56 to 62% chance of meeting that 2 degree target. That's pretty risky. That's pretty bad odds for something you want to avoid. The third point I'd like to make is that this is how the global target translates to the UK. Now what the CCC do is that they appropriate a massively large share of the allowable global carbon emissions to the UK. This is clearly not a scientific issue, it's an equity, a political, public discussion about what's fair between countries. They assume that it's only by 2050 that the UK and the rest of the developed countries have the same emissions as developing countries. So not only do historical emissions not get included, but we are assuming that the vast majority of future emissions are taken by developed countries. So there are 3 reasons then why the 2050 to 80% target in the DECC parameter model is really pretty generous to the UK if you want to tackle climate change in a fair way. We estimated in a report we did a few years ago, Reckless Gamblers, which you can see on the web, that you would need I don't know how this works actually. I'll get it, that you need 80% cuts by 2030 rather than 80% cuts by 2050. And I think that the Tyndall Centre, John and Kevin's work and other people have said that perhaps even tougher than 80%. So what would that mean? What would tackling an 80% target mean? Well, the first thing I think it means is that the politics needs to change. While we're having this conference, the Committee on Climate Change are having a desperate rearguard battle to save the current fourth carbon budget. Their report came out today saying there's no economic basis for changing it at all. But the striking thing is that they're trying to prevent it being weakened, and I'm arguing here, and lots of other people argue, that it really should be strengthened. And why that matters, and it's not just about numbers, is that the existing budget is being used by the government to justify all sorts of high carbon infrastructure. Oil, road, airports, fracking, that's all apparently compatible with tackling climate change. So what we did with the DECC pathway model, to bring it back to what I'm supposed to be talking about, is that DECC have this pathway model. We wanted to hack into it to see that if you went foot to the floor, could you genuinely deliver this sort of target? Now, the first thing I'd say about delivering tough targets is that, yeah, it might be difficult, but it'll be a hell of a lot more difficult if we don't start right now. If we'd started in 1995, that would have been the red line, reasonably gentle slope. If we start now, that's a pretty steep slope. But if we delay 10 years, then it just gets ridiculous if you want to have any serious chance of stopping 2 degrees. So first thing, you've got to go fast. But we did look at what you could do. Can you use the DECC model to genuinely meet a tough target, 9 gigaton target, which is a fair allocation for the UK? And when we first did it, we found that no, you could not. If we put our foot to the floor, we still came up about 3 gigatons of carbon too high. We felt perhaps that that was something to do with the model. So we looked at the model and to see, is it genuinely modelling a foot to the floor approach? Could you do more than this? And this is what the model looks like. If you just go to the DECC website and search for DECC and pathways or pathway calculator, it's easy to find. What you've got in the model is roughly 40 parameters, 20-ish on supply, 20-ish on demand. And for each one, you can select an option of 1 to 4, where 1 is do nothing and 4 is labelled heroic effort. On the supply side, lots of the options are genuinely heroic. Level 4 for offshore wind is 40,000 turbines, or nuclear, which they're counting as acceptable for climate change. They're saying level 4 for that is 50 3-gigawatt power stations between now and 2050, which is clearly a lot more than the 1 that's planned at the moment. On the supply side, you don't need to go to level 4 to decarbonise electricity supply. You can do it on level 2 or 3. But what the difference is on the demand side, where the DECC model really has the biggest scope for improvement. Just as an example, heroic ambition on aviation, for international aviation, sees the number of flights increasing by 85%. On surface transport, level 4 sees no decrease in mileage travelled at all in the next 40 years. I would think that we could do a bit better than that. Similarly for homes, McKinsey have done the study saying, I won't go into this graph, but McKinsey for DECC have said you can find another 100 terawatt hours of untapped electricity demand reduction. So there's a lot more that can be done about demand. I do feel with the pathway that DECC were probably lent on by the Department for Transport for this, but it reflects a broader point that demand reduction and energy efficiency don't get anywhere near enough attention in the policy debate, both in this model but also politics at the highest level. It's where the biggest gains can be made most quickly and at least cost. So why is it not at the highest priority? And I'll just give you 3 examples why it's so absolutely relevant. Michael Fallon in the last week, he said, oil and gas, we need a maximise recovery, 2 minutes got you, maximise recovery strategy. Where's the minimise demand strategy for oil and gas? Similarly, aviation, we've got a big debate about Heathrow. Why is no new runway an option at all? All the 3 political parties want to help people with bills, but none of them are calling for the only thing that would genuinely make a big difference, which is to have a massive public investment in people's homes and making them energy efficient. I've got my 2 minutes, so I'm going to skip quite a lot. What I would say is I'd try and bring it back to what Naomi Klein was talking about yesterday. When we hacked the model, we did find that you could, with a foot to the floor approach, you could meet these tough targets. It is possible to do. And I think what tougher targets does is the focus it has on a foot to the floor approach liberates us a little bit in a way that helps with the politics. Naomi said yesterday that you need a clear moral vision of an alternative, and I think that's hard to do if you express that vision around 2 degrees or 350 parts per million or gigatons or pathways. What needs to happen seems to be much more concrete than that. A foot to the floor approach means to me about 4 different things. It means, first, no new fossil fuel extraction. We need to keep most of this stuff in the ground. Secondly, no new high carbon infrastructure. We can't keep thinking that more oil, more roads, more airports, more fracking is somehow compatible with tackling climate change. Third, save as much energy as possible, cut demand. And lastly, all the energy which we then do need to use, that all has to be renewable. And these sorts of non-abstract demands, rather than gigatons and pathways and 2 degrees, they seem to be part of the basis for building a strong set of alliances that will help pressure politicians, because they're about real concrete things, pressure politicians to take climate change as the real emergency that genuinely is. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I can ask Professor Terry Barker from UEA at the University of Cambridge to talk about demand-side regulation and the policy mix to achieve radical greenhouse gas reductions, modeling global decarbonization with E3 and G. Terry.
Well, thank you very much to the organisers of this conference for making it happen. I've been very interested in many of the contributions, but I'm going to go from the local small scale that we've been talking about to the global scale and give you some numbers. Basically, the objective of my exercise is to look at the economics of all of this on a scale of countries, on whole economy scales, and to take an exercise that we've been doing as part of a book on decarbonising the global economy, and look at the modelling in that exercise and see if radical cuts in emissions in Annex 1 countries, in the Annex 1 area, over a 10-year period, taking radical as being 8% per annum reduction in CO2 emissions, whether that was economically feasible, and indeed with some remarks as to whether it's technologically feasible or not. And to do this, we've used the International Energy Agency's 450 and current policies and new policy scenarios. They've been working on these scenarios over several years now, and looking at the relationship they've got between energy saving investments, the energy saving themselves coming from those investments, and when those take place and where they take place and the policies behind them. And so we've looked at those and looked at a mix of policies, not just considering Annex 1 countries, but considering all the countries that do have these policies and are large-scale emitters. And to do the exercise, I've used our large-scale econometric model, which is a simulation model. Importantly, it's post-Keynesian in the sense that it doesn't move to an equilibrium, but it's a dynamic model. It covers the economy and the energy system in an integrated way. So briefly on the supply side and demand side action, the point I'm making here is that these are complementary, that if electricity isn't decarbonised, then substitution in final demand away from fossil fuels towards electricity may well lead to higher emissions altogether. For example, thinking of switching over to electric cars, if the electricity is coming from carbon-based fuels, then of course this could lead to higher emissions. But of course there's a whole lot of other things, and that is that substitution from fossil fuels towards renewables is at lower cost and becoming made much more effective, and I think we've seen this already in the power sector compared to final demand sectors, and that higher electricity prices coming from a policy of emission trading in the power sector does support demand side regulation and prevent rebound. So and also complementing that, on the demand side, action is diffused, less price sensitive, and there are many more barriers to overcome. So these are the main assumptions and results. First of all, I'm just going to go down these points here, that oil demand falls in decarbonisation, particularly the transport sector, and so oil prices tend to be lower, and this affects the world economy. There's several of the here with looking at emission trading, these are average prices, and you can see, of course, these are going up very substantially. There are several schemes, and they have different schemes have different price rises, so it's just one scheme for the whole world. And then we have additional investment, which is amounting about 6% increasing on the reference scenario investment. And what we get here is, well, first of all, there's a point here that the Annex 1 countries, by 2020, are only about 1/3 of the emissions of CO2. So, of course, world action is essential if we're going to achieve major reductions in emissions, global emissions. But here you see this target is achieved of the 8% per annum. But you can see worldwide there's also a lot of action here going on in China particularly. GDP is actually slightly higher, consumer expenditure is a little bit higher, and of course investment is higher, because this is the largest increases in investment. But all those growth rates are well in line with the kind of errors and ranges of uncertainty associated with growth rates. So this isn't a spectacular, to achieve this enormous reduction in emissions doesn't require a spectacular amount of investment and enormous costs in terms of GDP following our approach. So I've got just 3 diagrams just illustrating that. And this first one shows the effect of just the emission trading scheme. This is really just the price effect, bringing down the emissions. So this is a really large lump of it, and this is coming through the energy intensive sectors, which of course emit most of the carbon. And then we've got the effect of power regulations, which is just really removing inefficient power stations and forcing down the carbon intensity of the power sector. And then finally we've got the final demand, the regulations here, which is what we've been talking about most of all, which is going to bring down this to here, these 3 to here. So these are the investments associated with that, and you can see that this is the most important increase, and this is why growth rates would tend to rise, simply because of the investments required over a sustained period in order to rebalance the world economy towards a much more electrified economy. And this shows how important demand-side regulations are in bringing forward the investment. So investments are very important for the demand side, and then employment is also, the demand-side regulations are the most important in terms of generating more jobs. You see there are more jobs from here to here, but you can see the scale, it's not very large, it's quite small in percentage terms, but nearly all of them coming from the demand-side regulations. And that's simply because the insulating of houses is very labour-intensive compared to renewables, putting more offshore wind power in the North Sea, for example. And another area which is extremely energy-intensive, employment-intensive, is biomass production. Biomass is very employment-intensive, the planting of the willow and the trees and whatever. So to conclude, it's extremely challenging for the political aspect of decarbonisation is very challenging. We've heard why it is challenging, and it's challenging not just because only a few countries have taken up the challenge and have already moved substantially towards decarbonisation, but many countries haven't and have moved the other way. It's more or less unprecedented in recent history to have this wide-scale reduction in CO2 emissions, particularly if it's given by policy as opposed to some kind of shock like the Soviet Union collapsing and being replaced by a capitalist economy which is closing down lots of inefficient factories. A word about the price effects. The allowance price without regulation, and I've got high allowance prices here, above $100 per tonne of CO2 by 2030, could yield reductions in CO2 emissions by about 2% a year over 2020-2030. That is in the range of the mitigation studies which you'll see when the Working Group 3 of the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report comes out. But the studies which are covered in the literature, very few of them at this kind of scale actually include regulations, partly because the methodology of most of the models is that the economy is working efficiently, and there isn't any room to improvement from reducing inefficiencies. Another conclusion is that supply side regulation is a necessary complement to the demand side regulation. Otherwise, there's a risk of actually increasing emissions. Then rapid action requires about 2 to 3 times the rate of extra investment estimated by the IEA for energy efficiency to 2020, and much stronger regulation would be necessary compared to what the IEA are talking about. But then, of course, they're not achieving these massive reductions, even to their 450 scenario through to 2035. But my final conclusion is that it appears to be economically and technically feasible, but I am very cautious when I look at some of the detailed results. For example, solar PV would require a sustained increase in capacity over that 10-year period, over 20% a year. Now, we have had rates of increase in solar PV, but from a smaller base, which have exceeded 20% a year, but it is nevertheless a very big ask. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Terry. The next speaker is Alice Hooker-Stroud, and she will talk about zero carbon Britain in terms of energy. Thank you, Alice.
Thanks, Corinne. Yes, so I'm Alice. I'm from the Centre for Alternative Technology. I'm going to be talking about Zero Carbon Britain, which is a project that's been running for 6 or 7 years now. Our most latest report, Rethinking the Future, was launched this summer, and it's about that report that I'm going to outline today. Basically, it's a technological solution to the problem, which we all know is not the entire solution. I'm going to go on to that a bit later. But basically, we call it a technologically robust scenario in which the UK has risen to the challenge of climate change. What does this mean? Basically, it means net zero greenhouse gas emissions. We will have to get there eventually, sooner rather than later. And so in our scenario, we're not just looking at greenhouse gas emissions from energy, but from land use and non-energy emissions as well. And in our scenario, we use technology that we have available now. We can implement it immediately, so hopefully we can get this going as soon as possible. The aims of the project really are to demonstrate that these kinds of integrated solutions do exist. There are lots of people who doubt that. It's important to have an example that demonstrates that they do. And through that, we're there to really support and inspire the action that's needed to achieve that kind of future. So that's what I'm going to talk about a bit later on, which is how this technological solution can really support the transition through this political or psychological, perhaps not an economical problem as it's been outlined, that we're looking at here. And I'm going to do that just through an example. So energy in ZCB is only one part of our model, and I'm just going to take you through this as an example of what we do and what it looks like. And I just want you to keep this in mind, which was a quote that came out from Stuart yesterday, and it really sort of summarises what I'm going to sort of barrage through over the next sort of 5 minutes or so. And the problem really is big. This is our energy system today. As you can see, and as you know, we burn a lot of fossil fuels, and we also have very high energy demands. In our model in ZCB, what we say is that we can reduce these demands. I'm not going to go through all of these instances here. For example, our heating demand has actually decreased via the same kinds of things that we heard about earlier on today. What I am going to highlight, though, is transport, because I haven't yet heard anything from the room that is akin to the kind of changes that we see in our transport system that is required for this amount of energy demand reduction. And it's a massive reduction that's actually possible. Part of that is the behaviour change aspect. So we do say, for example, that people will have to travel less. I think we've had a really good example over this conference about how teleconferencing can enable that kind of fewer transport miles, for example. We also say that people travel differently. So less car use, more public transport use, Over shorter journeys, we'd say more cycling and more walking. So these are lifestyle changes that we're talking about. An additional lifestyle change that is in complete contrast to what we just heard 2 presentations ago. So as opposed to the DECC 2050 model that projects an increase in flights of 85%, we find out that we have to reduce domestic and international aviation to 1/3 of current levels. So these are really big changes, but they only really get us half the way in terms of our energy demand reduction from transport. The other half is the technology side. Basically, we electrify the systems as far as we possibly can. All electric cars, electric rail. There are some freight, for example, some pieces of shipping we can do something about, like we heard about from Alice earlier. Aviation we can't electrify, but just electrifying these systems, because the electric vehicles are so much more efficient, they give us more miles per unit of energy consumed in comparison to fossil fuel transport systems, gives us this other whack of demand reduction. So these kinds of examples and other things that go through these other sectors give us a 60% reduction in energy demand. And we think this is technologically feasible given the technology that we have today. But we still need to provide a lot of energy without emitting greenhouse gases. We're a net zero carbon scenario. And how do we do that? Well, fortunately, in the UK, we live in a very, very windy country. In fact, we have one of the best wind resources in the world, not just in Europe, and we really use that to our advantage. So this is how our energy goes from the supply side on the left to the demands that I've just been talking about on the right, and as you can see, we rely very, very heavily on wind. In fact, about half of our energy comes from onshore and offshore wind. There's a suite of other renewables that are stuck in there. I'll take you through that in a minute. And the question that we've really been asked over this most recent research phase is whether or not an energy system that relies so heavily on renewables is a reliable one. Basically, when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, can we keep the lights on? So this is what we've been looking into over the last year, really. A fine-grained detailed analysis, actually, of what this looks like. So based on 10 years' worth of hourly weather and demand data, so that's 88,000 hours roughly, we model this system. For example, if we were to put 2 offshore wind farms in these locations, we can project, using wind data from NASA, what their energy output would be on an hourly basis over that 10-year period. We can do that for offshore locations all around the UK. We can also do that for onshore wind. We know how the tides behave, and we can estimate what we'd get out of our solar PV systems in our scenario. So this gives us a sort of a demand profile on an hourly basis of our electricity supply under our ZCB scenario. We can do the same for demand. A lot of this is taken from demand data over the same period. We have that from the government here in the UK. The main thing that changes here is that this is now modelling that reduced demand, so the 60% reduction in demand. And we also link the heating in our building systems to the temperature that's outside. So this is what gives us our demand profile over, the, again, 10-year period, every hour, and we put them together. And as you can see from this picture, as our critics have often suggested to us, they are in fact correct, our supply and demand will not match up in this system. You can see clearly that there are some areas where we have a surplus of electricity, but there are also some areas where we have a very clear shortfall. And that's really, really important that we cater for that shortfall. People get very concerned about not having the energy that they require at the time that they require it. So we figured a way of getting around this problem, and it is largely dependent on biomass, and I've highlighted that in the top right-hand corner there. Another part of Zero Carbon Britain is looking into land use. And actually we find, I'm not going to explain now, if we reorganise our land use here in the UK, although we don't have very much of it, our land is very precious, we can actually provide all of the biomass that we require for this system. So what we do is we take this biomass in the top right-hand corner, we combine it with hydrogen, which comes from surplus electricity that we're not using at times when we have a higher electricity supply than we do demand. We use that electricity to make hydrogen. The combination of hydrogen and biomass is actually really important because it's that biomass that we don't have very much of. And the hydrogen kind of gives us more bang for its buck. So we get more energy out of that biomass as a result. Through these chemical processes, we can create synthetic gas and synthetic liquid fuels, very much like the hydrocarbons that we use today, in fact. These are easily storable and easily transportable. So they cater for some of the demands, for example, in industry and transport, and a very small proportion of them, in fact, are used and burnt in backup gas power stations. Very similar to the ones we have today, except for the fact that we can ramp them up and down very, very quickly. So there is a very, very responsive system which allows us to cater for this shortfall in electricity demand. So just to highlight, that's that part of that diagram there, and that's why I wasn't talking about the biomass earlier. And in conclusion, the UK energy supply in ZCB looks vastly different from that today. It's an entirely different system, but we have shown that it is possible to provide a reliable, zero-carbon energy system. We can use our own natural resources, it's 100% renewables, and we don't need nuclear power and we don't need fossil fuels. But we do have to make some big changes. And I'm briefly just going to highlight why I think this is actually a very important project, even though it's a technological solution. Why is it useful? One, it helps us see the scale of our actions. So, for example, we can look at what happens when we change all our light bulbs to LEDs, and we can contrast that to electrifying our transport system. It is a tool that can help others forge per will. For example, we have a lot of campaign organisations that use what we generate in ZCB as a viable alternative future. It also helps local groups fit into the bigger picture, and I thought this came out really strongly yesterday, that lots of people felt that local groups were really the way forwards in moving this climate debate onwards. And we actually find that most people who are interested in using ZCB are local groups. We get a lot of interest from transition towns. We're just starting a project actually with Mark Chivers and Dorset County Council on downscaling Zero Carbon Britain to a county level. And what we're going to do after we've made that scenario is they're then going to measure the progress that Dorset makes year on year to that Zero Carbon Britain scenario. It also provides a positive vision. I haven't spoken very much about this, but we have done a small amount of analysis on benefits beyond carbon. What does it look like? An initial analysis points to more jobs, better outlook for biodiversity, for example, higher well-being, higher health levels, the whole part of land use and foods and diets comes into that, but also things like cycling more, walking more. And we do think, actually, in contrast particularly to a scenario where we don't implement some of these solutions, then this really is an incredibly positive vision of the future. Finally, it helps us imagine that alternative future. So when we're sat around making this model, we kind of imagine using spreadsheets, which is a bit weird and most people can't relate to very well. But we do also use focus groups. So we sit around with other people and we describe this technological backdrop as a scenario, and we allow them to imagine what living in ZCB would be like. Going to work, seeing your friends, hanging out, doing all the things that you might normally do, in fact. Very little changes. So this is the main reason. I just wanted to go back to what Naomi Klein said yesterday and say that perhaps something like Zero Carbon Britain or Zero Carbon Britain itself is really that alternative. It really helps us imagine what it might be like once we implement all of these changes. And finally, our report is available to download free if you didn't manage to pick up one off the table today or yesterday. It's online, and there's also the report in short on the table outside, and please come and talk to me if you're interested anymore. Thank you.
Thank you for this. The 2050 calculator, should it have more options, energy demand and how it affects the economy and how to reach zero carbon? Is this realistic? Can we have questions? Alice here to start. I will go in that direction.
Hello, Alice Bowes-Larkin from Tyndall Manchester. Just a question for Alice. I was just wondering about the time frame of the vision. Have you thought about what sort of time frame you're talking about and looked at the cumulative CO2 emissions and different pathways to that vision?
Just not straight away. We'll take one question in the back here. Yeah.
John Barrett, University of Leeds. A question for Terry. I've quite a lot of concern at the dominance of the CGE models in Working Group 3, and as one of the lead authors have noticed this quite strongly, and therefore regulations are excluded. I would love to hear more about the regulations that you're considering and thinking within this model for your demand and your supply side scenarios.
One more question, the lady in the back.
Thanks very much. It's a question for Alice. What other countries do you know that have done a similar analysis to yours? And which companies or, you know, other sort of actors? I ask this because I have a paper in which I proposed a goal of net zero emissions by 2050 as the global goal for the UNFCCC negotiations. And whether or not they adopt it, this could be something that could be adopted outside of that independently by many others. And my research has shown that actually there aren't that many other exercises. Germany has just done one. But I'd be very keen to know how, outside of Britain, whether you know of similar exercises. Thank you.
Thank you. There was another question in that area. Yes, please. Is that for Alice or not for Alice?
This one's for Alice.
For Alice. Let's take a one not for Alice, so Alice can think about her question. There was one in the front here. John, please. I'll come back to you. Alice or not Alice?
Not Alice.
Yeah.
Simon, in fact.
Simon, good.
Simon, I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the foot to the floor, as you put it, in the DECC model. What did you have to change?
Okay, so we have now one each. So Terry, do you want to start?
Yes. Yeah. The International Energy Agency do have a fairly comprehensive lists of the regulations required for the different groups of policies that they model. And these are the policies that we've chosen. You can see those in their climate map of, I think, April or May this year, and there's a whole section on energy efficiency in the World Energy Outlook 2012. But we've already heard in some of the earlier presentations about some of these regulations. For example, reducing your carbon emissions for vehicles. There is a problem in all of this, and that is it's the same problem that was mentioned in that presentation, and that is there's a difference between the investment in a new car, having a new car, and its performance, and its actual use, because the actual use can mean that there is much more emissions than you might expect from the investment. So it may well be that the investment figures I've mentioned are too low, and it should be much higher.
Thank you. Simon?
Yeah, there were 5 things we looked at. We would have liked to have done more, and I think that now you've done a much better job than we did of hacking the calculator, perhaps. Anyway, what they were, international aviation, clearly having a scenario where you had lower demand rather than 85% increase was one. Similarly for domestic demand, both the total amount of miles travelled but also the modal share within them. Agricultural emissions, we felt there was more that could be done on that than was assumed in DECC's model. We also looked at negative emissions technologies. Now, I appreciate that some negative emissions technologies are absolutely horrendous, like solar panel reflectors in the sky and silver linings in clouds, not silver, silver in clouds. But there are some negative emissions technologies which are less appalling than others. We've done a report on it, Negatons, on our website, and that goes into which are better technologies than others. And so we looked at that technology more than we've done previously. And the last one, which relates to Brenda's talk earlier, which was looking at electricity demand. And again, the work that McKinsey have done in LED lighting, we feel that there was more that could be done on that compared with what DECC were assuming.
Thank you, Alice.
Hi, so Alice. Yes, we do have a date. Loosely speaking, it's about 2030, but it does depend on a couple of things. It depends roughly on when we start. I mean, you could argue that we have made a start, but we're not progressing quite far enough yet. It also depends on, and actually a lot of this work is based on the budgets that you guys have put together. And some of that depends on how much historic responsibility you take for the emissions that we've already emitted. You could argue that zero is actually not far enough. Peter and I have had many discussions actually about whether this really is radical enough a vision. So you could argue that we actually need to go negative. Another point that I just wanted to make was that I personally, this is not necessarily a zero carbon Britain thing, but I personally am not sure that these targets are helpful. I find it much, much better when I'm talking to people who aren't specialists in this area, just to say, as soon as we possibly can, we really need to get this together now, basically. So dates and things make people a bit confused and think, well, maybe I don't have to do anything this year, I can do it next year. And finally, it's more important to look at like what the final vision is, because I think if you start doing things like, you know, so zero carbon by 2030, which means a certain amount by 2020, 2010, then you end up actually sometimes making decisions that don't allow you to get that last bit. So if you make decisions that are aimed at those sort of interim targets, then you're kind of cutting off some opportunity for you later on. So yes, the target is 2030 based on those cumulative emissions budgets, a little bit of wiggle room perhaps. The question about other countries having done this, I think there are a couple of other examples, but I'm not aware of very many. I think part of the problem might be actually that a lot of people who do research into scenarios tend to be government funded, and so they will be funded to research whatever that government has decided is the political target. And so a zero carbon scenario is really not on many people's radars, although it might be worth asking Peter. I know that he has done a lot of research into other scenarios that are out there and how they sort of scale to zero carbon Britain, so pick up on him later if you wanted to chat more.
Thank you. So that's an obvious cue for Peter. Do you want to say a few words, Peter, on this straight away? No. Just very briefly?
Yes, well, we heard from the Australians before. They've been the most thorough in the sense,
Thank you.
partly inspired by early work. Sweden has just done one, Germany has,
Thank you.
And WWF.
We'll take straight away the question for Alice, which I didn't allow.
Extremely
before.
quickly, Tanja Müller from Germany. Could you speak a little more about the demand reduction, 60%? Because all the scenarios for Germany that I'm aware of don't tackle the question of demand reduction, maybe because of cowardice or maybe because they couldn't find a way. So I'd be very interested to hear a few more words on that. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's go in that side here. The person in the back with the white shirt there. Yeah.
Finally. It was a response to Simon's thing earlier. He was one of the people that's been hacking the calculator. But actually, rather than going to the detail, it's also then across to CAT as well. That it is a fantastic tool as an opportunity to bring together a whole lot of people that are researching in this field and actually make the research into something real that practitioners like those of us that are, some of us that are here, that are doing stuff can actually then marshal our plans with, as Alice just said. And so my plea is to say we can make this calculator work for us. We can use it to mean we don't all have to say different things in inch-thick reports. We can say something a lot more focused. As you said, there are some stats hidden in that are wrong. My favourite being the 8 million extra households that the CLG hid in it to cope with reduction in household size, which does make your domestic emissions reductions nigh on impossible. And once you find them, my question is, can we actually do something other than patting ourselves on the back and use the calculator as a thing to unite us together and get the work done that includes CAT as well and anyone else that's interested?
Thank you. There was one in the back, please.
Nick Bardsley, University of Reading. My question is about the biofuels component of this, which came up a couple of times. So it seems to me that there should be a fairly high burden of proof on advocates of biofuels to show that it's not going to be a disaster in terms of land use and labour requirements. And my reason for saying that comes from a book that came out a couple of years ago called The Biofuel Delusion, which applied some very basic energetics to currently available biofuel from corn ethanol, which showed that if the biofuel was genuinely zero carbon, that it would take more than the land use currently in agricultural production for the European Union to meet its 10% by 2020 target. So
thank you.
How can we rely on that?
Thank you. So there's two questions here in the front, please. Very brief, please.
David Wasdell, Bullock Project. This is for Simon. Two thank yous and a question.
Simon,
it's very brief. I will curry it. Believe me. A huge thank you for the clarity of the executive summary that you put together. I think that's beautiful. It's practical. Thank you. A thank you also for the courage to look at the 2 degrees, 1.5 and 1, and the effects that make. The question, Corinne was co-author on a paper that came out on sensitivity in the Anthropocene earlier this year, which was pleading for a whole Earth system sensitivity to be used to determine the budgeting, which brings the budget available right down, or even collapses it to a debt. Have you seen that, and how would you take that into account in the kind of work you're doing?
Thank you. Just in front of you, also very brief, please.
Mike Copeland, Planet Hydrogen. Thanks, Alice, for the presentation. Two little matters which might strike you as quibbles. Firstly, about biofuels. Fundamentally, intrinsically, they return carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, thereby not reducing concentrations, although they do replace fossil fuels. And secondly, the electrification of cars, say 30 million of them in this country, demands an enormous increase in the amount of lithium to be used. And lithium mining is a very strong issue in Colombia, where it comes from, where indigenous people resent very much the presence of those mines. Are these things on your mind as well?
Thank you, thank you. So we have spread across the speakers, so we'll do one more and then we'll have to close it here, I'm afraid. Terry?
No, there's no questions.
No questions. Was there another point for you? Yeah, okay, no. Simon?
Very quickly, because there were a lot of points there.
They were right, yeah.
Friends of the Earth campaigns against biofuels in general, and some sourcing from with the UK if you can really prove that it's sustainable, yes, but generally we campaign against it. I can send more detail on that. The DECC calculator assumes that biofuels are zero carbon, which we feel is a mistake. DECC are changing the calculator to reflect their research that they've been doing on that, so we hope that will be published soon. On the carbon budget point, I agree that there are a number of different ways you could look at carbon budgets. The budget that I put up was based on a 33% chance of 2 degrees. Personally, I think that's too high and too risky. Even with that, that's a foot to a floor, so it doesn't change the fundamental issue that for reasonable chances of anything, it's still foot to the floor. It doesn't make it even more foot to the floor than that, so foot to the floor. And on the point about hacking the calculator, absolutely. I think the work that Zero Carbon Britain do is absolutely wonderful, and we in the NGO community should work with Kat more on this because it's great. So yeah, we should definitely work on those opportunities to widen the use of the calculator and ZCB's work.
Just as a further comment on that point in terms of collaboration, I'm always really pro-collaboration. I think there is actually a little bit of a difficulty between campaigning NGOs actually, is that a lot of them compete for members, and so by dint they need to somehow seem different from each other, and so adopting the same model we've actually found quite hard, and we can work much harder at doing that, and I think that we should, and there are lots of conversations that are opening about that. With regards to the detail on demand reduction, I will stay here and come and talk to me because there's quite a lot of detail and we don't have very much time. Land use and labour, so there was a couple of questions that were talking about biofuels and concerns about biofuels. So one of the reasons that we choose to reorganise the land use in the UK is that we want to provide our own biomass, and that's really important. There are lots and lots of risks with using biomass to make biofuels or synthetic liquid fuels or synthetic gases that have been highlighted by campaign groups such as Biofuels Watch, and they are very legitimate concerns. We think that by growing our own biomass here in the UK, they are second generation biomass, so we're talking woods and grasses mainly, we have the best chance actually to keep them both carbon neutral and sustainable. So we can manage where we get them from, what we're doing with them, make sure that we're replanting as soon as we're taking that wood down, for example, and using it in our energy system, which should maintain its carbon neutrality. So there are lots of dangers with biofuels, biomass, etc. We should be concerned about them, and in our model we're trying to take that into account by taking responsibility and growing that at home. The last question was about cars and lithium batteries, and I have very little to say, I'm afraid, because we haven't done an assessment on how much lithium we'd require.
Okay, thank you very much. On this, we'll close the last session. I'd like to thank the speakers. It is clear that we could have spent another 2 days on this. There's also an entire community of modelers out there who actually try to do also radical mitigation pathways. It's a rich literature, but we had a very nice group of presentations today and very strong in the answering and questioning as well. So thank you very much.
Session that we've run through together, but we wanted to keep everybody together as much as possible, and we felt like if we had a sort of frivolous tea break at this stage, some of you might have a biscuit and make for the door. So we're going to have a wrap up from our four panelists. How we're going to do it is we're going to go for Corinne first, then Andrew, then Caroline, and then we'll open up the floor so that these burning questions or comments, so you don't feel it has to be a question about the wrap up. It'll have a nice long space for us to talk about any comments or issues that you have, and then Kevin will do his wrap up and close the conference as the last thing. So I'll pass over straight on to Corinne.
Yes, thanks, Carly. So I had the chance to open the conference yesterday to say that one of the things I was looking for is examples of whether radical mitigation are possible, or radical emission reduction are possible. And actually in the last 2 days, and particularly today, it was plentiful of examples of things that have occurred or things that could occur, but there's really, the obstacles are relatively limited technologically. It is another thing, though, to talk about the speed of change. And when the speed of change entered the equation here, then immediately the biggest obstacle was in our collective minds. As I made the point myself, future emissions are in future activities and not in the past, including in infrastructure. And that's an extremely big challenge. One thing that we haven't talked about very much, just a little bit in this last 2 days, is who has the responsibility to do what. And I think that we have talked a lot about what politicians and policymakers should do, but I'm not entirely convinced myself, and Caroline, you'll have the chance to talk in a minute, that it is entirely their responsibility. And what I would like to ask everybody here is when you get out of this conference and before you enter your day job tomorrow, to reflect a little bit on what it is that this conference has brought to you and what it is that you would like to do actually in the future, differently or the same and more, or a bit louder, or what is it that you would like to do. One thing that I would like to see myself is Neil McCabe, the Dublin Fire Brigade, training become Prime Minister of the UK very soon. I think he wins the medal in this conference. He was very inspiring this morning. Thank you so much, Neil. what it is that I would like to do myself. I also need to reflect on this. But one thing that is very clear is I'm a natural scientist myself. I came into natural science because I like numbers. And actually what is needed is really more to talk to people, to go and say what it is that I know about climate change, what it is that people assume, things like negative emissions in the future, which in my view are probably quite unrealistic at a global scale. So talk more to people and actually try to bring within the Tyndall Center, as Tyndall Director, to bring this momentum together so that as a group we can have a voice that speaks louder and louder. And so that means spending a lot of time outside of my comfort zone. And speaking of comfort zone, we did collectively spend a little bit of time out of our comfort zone in this conference. The thing that caused the most stress for us organizers was by far the web links, and are they going to work? And can we get Naomi Klein and to speak to us in a way that we can understand yesterday? And I'm so pleased that this has actually worked, because to me this is really an indication that we can really actually do things differently. It was not perfect, but it was good enough, and we can build on this. And that's all I have to say.
Okay, so I thought I'd kick off with one of my favourite insights from John Ruskin, who made the observation that all great and beautiful work comes first from looking without shrinking into the darkness. And I think people who are prepared to look the climate challenge in the face and ask the difficult questions like this conference has done is preparing the ground by doing that. My other favourite words of insight come from the Welsh cultural critic Raymond Williams, who said that to be truly radical, we have to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. And I think that's something else that the group of people at this conference has been trying to do. For that, I think it's something that came up yesterday. We need, what was it called? An attractive psychology. I should say that when we had that little outburst of philosophical meditation yesterday, it threw me right back to the 1980s and the first outbreak of postmodernism. I remembered imbibing those dodgy substances, by which I mean French social philosophy. And I connected that with kind of change agents in the world that we're more familiar with, like our friend Martin Luther King, who talked about, he famously said, or rather famously didn't say, I have a nightmare, but he also didn't say, I have a slightly confusing philosophical workshop. He talked very much about sort of practical ways of doing it. And I think as we look around the world, once we see the possibility of things being different is already out there, we allow for the contingency of very different ways of living, whether that's something as straightforward as a Dutch 4-day week as a social norm, or a Dublin fire station that's starting a revolution, or Bhutanese economic indicators. Once we can begin to join together things which are already happening in the world, which speak to the radical change that we're talking about. You could throw in Nicaragua's plans for almost complete decarbonisation. You start to believe in the possibility of a different world. We also know from our own research, we haven't talked about it much in the last couple of days, that in terms of our levels of consumption and our own the work that we did at the New Economics Foundation on well-being, we know that whether you're living very frugally and in a very difficult and challenging way down at about one planet living, or whether you've got TVs the size of swimming pools and you're flying around the world 10 times a year, up at 8 planet living, that your chances of good life satisfaction are relatively unaltered. You've got just as good a chance of having good life satisfaction at the bottom end of the consumption scale as you do at the top end of the consumption scale. I'm one of those people who put their hand up and say that I do believe in the physical world. I think it exists. And I think another thing that we can flip, which is a deep lesson from green economics, the old 4 R's of repair, reduce, reuse, recycle, that if you think of consumerism or overconsumption as a sort of abusive relationship with the material world, with the real world, that we can reimagine that as a healthy relationship with a green economy. We can learn to love stuff in a good way, to care for it, conserve it, look after it, keep it going. I mentioned working time. That's another great social innovation that opens up the opportunity for reimagining the economy, in which radical emissions become possible, in which new social norms take root through social contagion. Somebody threw out the idea of the curfew. It reminded me of that the famous tale about the fact that all those railings that got removed for the war effort in World War II in London, most of them never got used. It was much more about making the point that we needed to do something different. So if we're not going to have kind of curfews everywhere, we could at least in cities like London, perhaps between the hours of 1 a.m. and 5 a.m., turn off the office lights and enjoy the sky again at night and be able to see the stars in real ways as well as in philosophical ways. Another little insight, we had a mention of a little blast back to how recent the order that we live with at the moment that makes things seem impossible, the neoliberal order, how recent that thing is. Born effectively in 1947 in the Swiss village of Montpellerin, which if you look at photographs of it is remarkably similar to the village in that French zombie program, The Returned, which is most appropriate when you saw neoliberalism as a sort of resurrection of zombie economics, neoclassical economics linked to beliefs in human freedom. But those people who were considered crazy did that other thing that we talked about. Through action at the periphery, on the right, they moved the centre of politics, ultimately, and in a relatively short period of time. Interestingly, Popper, the philosopher who was part of that early group, left them because he saw the paradox that people who preach complete freedom actually become its enemies by allowing the weak to be enslaved by the strong. That cycle turns. I think it's turning again, and we know through the way it's changed in the past that it can change again, and we should take confidence from that, and we should have some of the self-confidence that the alternative have. On a practical level, I mean, I made a picture of Green New Deal. I think in terms of actually making it happen and speaking to the economic moment, something which provides jobs, gives you warm homes, reboots the economy, builds energy security, is an effective way to go about doing it. We heard some practical examples and practical barriers about access to cheap and patient capital. Well, green quantitative easing would be a way of meeting that need. We heard about making it personal, and we had proposals around personal carbon trading and tradable emissions quotas, which is one of the ways in which we can do that. Unburnable carbon. We know we can't burn all the stuff we know about already, so why explore for any more? Draw a line under that. The lessons from Samuel Plimsoll that if you want to put a line, a sort of safe carrying capacity on the economy as a whole, think no more of that hard fought but ultimately successful attempt to introduce safety in shipping. If you want to see that symbol, it's all about you in London. It's the underground symbol. Naomi talked about the needs of building a movement. One of the ways in which you can do that, there was a few grumbles about our friend Jaap Speer, who demystified the orthodox model. I thought it was rather wonderful because I remember the days when attempts to do things more socially progressive in London were delegitimized by being mocked. I thought Jaap came back with a pretty good account of the nonsense, the truth by assertion, the non-evidence-based economics, which is currently dominant and in position. I think one of our great challenges, and we're never going to get away from this, well, one of the problems is the media and how we get the message through. I just thought I'd feed back to you 3 quick bullet points from, I went to a session on how the global economy gets reported at Channel 4, and the Sky TV were there and the BBC were there, and they gave out some audience research which they don't normally make public. And they said there's 3 big things that you need to know about at the moment, about what people watching the TV and listening to the radio really care about. One is fairness. People are instantly responsive to things being unfair. And my God, if we don't get radical emissions reduction, we are going to be living in a world which is much more unfair than it is at the moment. The second thing is that what turns people off more than anything else is the mere mention of politicians. They give people a dial, and you turn it, whether you're interested or not interested. They just had to mention the politician's name, and the dial went down. That might not be a way that we want to talk about it. The third thing they said is that virtually none of their journalists understand economics, so we have an educational mission to go on there. We're going to be stuck with making decisions in circumstances of uncertainty and with imperfect information. That shouldn't trouble us. It doesn't trouble the opposition. It's all you can ever do. And I know I'm speaking to a crowd of a lot of people who work in the academic world. for which, you know, every paper finishes, more research is necessary. We're going to have to learn how to act with the information that we have and to act radically and quickly. We don't know what we will achieve until we try. We do know our direction of travel. We know that there will be emergent consequences that we have to deal with on the way, but we must begin, we must take a step, we must move on. And I'm really glad that this conference has happened and that you're all here. Thank you.
Okay, we'll now move on to Caroline, who'll be glad to hear that we have not issued our audience with interest dials.
No, thank you.
Twitter
is almost the
Present
same
company
thing,
accepted.
There's stuff going up there behind me saying, shut up. Anyway, thank you so much to Kevin, to Corinne, to the whole of Tyndall for inviting me to say a few words at this incredibly important and exciting conference, and for inviting a politician onto the panel. That was very brave. And I have to say, it's been very nice to have a kind of reality check, really, because sometimes being on my own in Westminster, I do kind of feel like maybe I'm the one who's a bit odd. So when everyone else thinks that 80% by 2050 is far too ambitious, and I'm just beginning to think, hang on a minute, it's really nice just to ground myself in the reality, which is all of you, and to remind myself that, that is Parliament that has a hell of a lot to do. I've been asked to talk about issues and implications for government, and I think it is important to be honest about a policy and political context which is worse today than it was when the Climate Change Act came into law 5 years ago. The sad truth is that we are miles away even from political agreement on boring, inadequate and entirely unambitious emissions reductions, let alone the radical emissions reductions that are rightly the focus of today's conference. And so in addition to Kevin's impressive list of green crap yesterday, I would add that under this government, just in the last few weeks, we've had backbenchers in a recent parliamentary debate sufficiently emboldened to call the Climate Act, and I quote, the most foolish piece of statute that any of us is likely to see in Parliament. We've seen a review of whether to water down the fourth carbon budget on the grounds that it might be uncompetitive, and virtually no discussion at all about making it faster and stronger. Proposals for minimum energy efficiency standards have been rejected, even though they will be hugely effective in cutting carbon, in creating jobs, in addressing fuel poverty. We've seen plans for home insulation rolled back. We've had a crystal clear policy from DECC, and I quote, maximising the economic production of domestic gas resources, including from the North Sea, and unconventional sources such as coal bed, methane and shale. That is government policy. And of course we saw in the autumn statement just last week some new tax breaks for fracking. And so looking at all of that, an alien observer might well conclude that the Commons chamber must surely be a different planet with its own atmosphere and its own sustaining biosphere, because we certainly don't seem to be dependent on the one that's out there that everyone else is worrying about. I said in questions yesterday in response that in terms of responding in a timely fashion to climate change, that it wasn't primarily a political problem. We were arguing whether or not it was psychology or was it a problem of politics. And of course it is both. But when I was saying that I still, even as a politician, regarded as a psychological problem in some respects, what I meant was that it's not the evidence that we lack, it's not the finance even that we lack, it is the political will, and how we generate that political will, I think certainly is a question of psychology as well as of politics. Given that we already now have so much evidence, hell, we had a typhoon on the very eve of the climate change talks, what else do we need in a sense? Given that evidence is there of a changing climate, what is it that will try to make sure that rather than going down in history as the species that spent all its time monitoring its own extinction, we actually get our fingers out and do something about it? Or in the words of the Nobel laureate Sherwood Rowland, what's the use of having developed a science well enough to make predictions if all we're going to do is stand around and wait for them to come true? And I have to say that I'm haunted by the film The Age of Stupid. I don't know if you've seen it, but in that Pete Postlethwaite is the sole survivor of some kind of climate catastrophe, and it's based in 2050, and he's looking back to today now. He's looking at newsreels of the kinds of weather events that we've seen all over the world. And he says in words that still make the hairs go up on the back of my neck when I say it, why is it, knowing what we knew then, we didn't act when there was still time? And that just seems to be the most monumental question that is facing all of us. What is it that's stopping us doing it? And there are lots of reasons around denial and so forth. And I would just give a quick plug to Sally Weintraub's wonderful book, in which she points out that denial doesn't necessarily have to mean apathy. It can actually mean that we can't bear too much truth. And I think we don't often talk about how climate change actually feels. We're all too busy talking about parts per million and and targets and so forth, that the actual sense of feeling, how do we feel psychologically when we are confronted with the possibility that we may well be on the way to looking at a planet that is going to be uninhabitable for millions of people, then in a sense it's not very surprising that a kind of sane response to that is to go down the pub and have a few drinks. So trying to understand the psychology of it, I think, is important as well. But I wanted to talk about the politics and just make three points, really, three challenges that I think we face in terms of the politics. And one of the problems, of course, that we have is that we have a pretty broken political system in which it's quite difficult to see how we break the vicious circle, the game of chicken and egg, whereby even politicians who get it claim they can't be as radical as they'd like because there isn't enough public support, and yet by their very inaction they entrench public misunderstanding, if not potentially apathy, and therefore that support is not forthcoming because people assume that the thing must be sorted, otherwise why wouldn't the politicians be jumping up and down about it more vociferously? And the first thing I would say about it is that I think we do need to demand chip from our politicians, that we shouldn't let them off the hook. And I just recall one of the things that makes me most sad about Tony Blair, and there are many things, but was just the waste that he came into power with such political capital, with such a majority. He was a charismatic leader, and he managed to persuade us all, or he didn't, but he managed to get us all to go down the road to a crazy war in Iraq on the basis of mythical weapons of mass destruction. That is what you can do if you're a political leader, and okay, so you lie and you do many other things, but you use your political capital to a certain end. Now imagine what could have happened if he'd used that political capital instead in terms of addressing climate change and had weathered all of the opposition that might have come. You know, political leadership can be there and we should be demanding it. Secondly, when politicians cry crocodile tears over the fact that they don't have any power, it's all those nasty corporations that have got the power, we need to remind them again and again that the reason the corporations have got that power is because the politicians gave it to them and continue to give it to them on a day-by-day basis. And if it's the case that through the World Trade Organization or through the latest transatlantic trade and investment partnership, that powers are being given away to allow corporations to trample all over democratically agreed environmental standards and labour standards and social standards and so forth, then in theory it is possible to get that power back again. And we could do that in a number of ways. We could throw out that trade and investment partnership for a start-off. We could bring back things like production and processing methods into the WTO. Actually, we should scrap the WTO altogether, obviously, but in the meantime, we can make it a little bit better. And we could be doing things like the Green Party has a policy, site here to sell here. If a company wants to sell its widgets in Britain, then it can jolly well set itself up in Britain and be subject to British environmental laws, labour laws, or whatever. So there are ways in which we can bring that power back. But the political system itself is broken. Sometimes people say we get the politicians we deserve, but with first past the post that's not even true, because a more proportional system where there are far fewer safe seats would mean that all MPs would have to care a hell of a lot more about the views of their constituents. And that's really important because, as Becky and others have said, the public and all of us actually do have quite a bit of power if we can just mobilise it a little bit more effectively and bring it to bear on our politicians. And if we had an electoral system that was more responsive to that influence, then we might just get politicians that are closer to the kind of things that we want. Becky talked about kind of making it safer for politicians to act by demonstrating that they won't be punished at the ballot box for taking radical action. And I think that initiatives like Transition Towns are really important in that respect because they show, by people actually getting on and doing it, that people are prepared to be more radical than the kind of political status quo would assume. And similarly, I think it's also very powerful when groups like 38 Degrees go into constituencies, they put up posters about sitting MPs and they publicly put pressure on them, shame them if necessary, to try to get them to take action. It is very, very powerful, and that is precisely why the government is trying to stop it. And I just want to say a few words about the lobbying bill that you might be aware of that's going through Parliament at the moment. If you're not aware of it, please become aware of it because it is absolutely sinister in its implications. Essentially, this is my second challenge really, is to get rid of this lobbying bill and the role of vested interests. It's called the gagging bill because it risks shutting down civil society engagement in the political system at the very time when politicians might just be listening, in other words, in the 12 months before a general election. Essentially what it does is it massively restricts the ability of NGOs to organise if there is anything about their campaigns which might be trying to affect the outcome of an election, by which I mean the kind of policies that are being promoted by the candidates. In other words, it is an absolute neutering policy, which will mean it's very, very hard for Friends of the Earth or Greenpeace or 38 Degrees to run the kind of political campaigns they've done to date. And it is absolutely, being designed with that in mind. It is really, really sinister. So this lobbying bill, it clamps down on the civil society NGOs and basically gives a carte blanche to everybody else. It does very little to actually challenge things like the fossil fuel industry. In December 2011, the story broke that at least 50 employees of companies, including EDF, Empower and Centrica, had been placed within government to work on energy issues over the previous 4 years. You don't need to worry about whether or not these companies are lobbying to change policy. They're actually in Whitehall writing it themselves. That's so much quicker. There are 195 meetings between the Department of Energy and Climate Change and the energy industry between the 2010 general election and March 2011. I mean, that is less than a year. That 195 meetings between ministers from DECC and the energy industry. Last summer, another Freedom of Information revealed an exclusive training course for senior Whitehall officials from 10 government departments. The programme that aimed to give civil service an understanding of energy was run by Shell. You will no doubt be reassured to know. And never mind Shell's business model being an outright conflict with the government's own 2 degrees climate objective, or the merits of protecting the planet's last remaining wilderness like the Arctic and the livelihoods of the 4 million people living there. So this register of lobbyists, which is also part of this lobbying bill, will do nothing to touch any of that. And that's why we need to be really, really focused on the fact that there are very serious vested interests who are organising and trying to oppose the kinds of vision that we want to bring forward. And I don't think we should be naive about that there really is a battle going on out there. You haven't stopped me, so I'm going to keep wittering on for 2 more minutes. The third challenge would be about, and this is a very big challenge to put into very few words, but it's just basically about trying to do more to overcome the way in which growth and the growth motive basically trumps every other policy objective. The lovely words of Kenneth Boulding that anyone who believes that you can have infinite growth on a finite planet is either a madman or an economist. And there are plenty of those in government. And growth is the ultimate objective of all government policy making, and it is spreading out still further. There is a deregulation bill currently in draft which proposes a new growth duty on all non-economic regulators. Just think about that, a new growth duty on all non-economic regulators, and it will include the Environment Agency and Natural England, for example. In the government's discourse, all regulation and red tape is bad. To give one illustration, the Housing Standards Review explains, and I quote, "The current housing code, standards, rules, regulations and guidance amount to an untenable forest, adding unnecessary cost and complexity to the house building process." So let's never mind about efficiency standards or anything else. So we need to be, and I'll end with this really, we need to be much more organised, I think, because that neoliberal mindset that we've heard from Andrew and we heard from Naomi as well hasn't come about by accident. It's come about because people organised to get it there. And I know Andrew and others have talked a lot about how that process has been put in place. And we need to be as good at organising on the other side. And somehow we assume that just because we're right, everything's going to work out okay. And unfortunately, being right isn't enough. You have to organise. You have to get these different interest groups, on the other side of the debate, absolutely countering things like Nigel Lawson's Global Warming Institute or the Taxpayers Alliance or whoever. They have got these positions in society because they've worked to get them, and they've got that voice because they've worked to get that voice, and we need to do the same. Can I just have 30 more seconds? I know it's really cheeky because I shut them, and Francois is in the audience because he'll kill me because I was nasty to him. But I just want to say one thing about hope in conclusion, in very much conclusion. Hope. There was a discussion with Maya and Naomi over hope, and I just wanted to say that hope isn't that kind of passive, weak thing that we might think, that we need to kind of go out there and really fight for hope. And Andrew alerted me to this lovely quote from the author Rebecca Solnit, who says, "To hope is to gamble. It's to bet on the future, on your desires, on the possibility that an open heart and uncertainty is better than gloom and safety. To hope is dangerous, and yet it's the opposite of fear, for to live is to risk." I say all this because hope is not like a lottery ticket you can sit on the sofa and clutch feeling lucky. I say it because hope is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency. Because hope should hove you out of the door, because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the earth's treasures and the grinding down of the poor and marginal. Hope just means another world might be possible, not promised, not guaranteed. Hope calls for action. Action is impossible without hope. To hope is to give yourself to the future, and that commitment to the future makes the present inhabitable. Anything could happen, and whether we act or not has everything to do with it.
Okay, so I'll open the floor. Remember that you can ask a question or respond, but you can also just make a comment. But please do try to be concise. There's lots of hands out there, and I like to try and get through everybody if I can. I'm going to start at the back because I got some sense that there was murmurings that people at the back were being ignored. So can we start on the right here by you, Jace? I'll take 3 or 4.
I wasn't sure if the conference is about radical ways of reducing emissions or ways of creating radical reductions in emissions. So radical reductions, that means just a big number quickly. And radical ways means ways which are outside the system, which are a bit threatening or challenging or revolutionary or unusual or scary. And I think we talked a lot about how to get big reductions, but I think we skirted around the fact that probably to get radical reductions, you need radical methods. And I feel we were very tame and polite and correct and diffident when we talked about ways of getting reductions.
Okay, thank you. Sinn Féin next to you in the white shirt.
Hi, me again. I've never been to an academic conference before, so forgive me if I'm speaking out of turn, but I'm a literal type of guy, and I was hoping to go away from here fueled up with a whole lot of new ways to make change. And I wonder whether I wasn't supposed to, but I still think that there are ways of doing it. And it struck me that because everyone here has studied subjects, they end up being in neat little compartments. But everything that we've tried to do with the coalition of us trying to make change in Manchester is find how to jump the spaces between all of these little containers. So we came up with the idea around the electric vehicles because we knew that there was a gap in the credibility of PV. I've been singing the praises of Tyndall for years, even though my partner won't let me go and listen to Kevin too often, just in case I come home too depressed. But because I want to know the statistics so that when I'm advising a householder on what is the real target so that they know they can make real change, I've got a good intellectual basis behind that number. I now realise, therefore, I've got to go and re-advise them. And so I wonder whether what could come out of this is a recognition that the third sector has to be the only way forward, because I think everyone's accepted that politicians can't do anything effectively until they're instructed to by a constituency of some form, and that therefore means we need to collectivise, those people from communities need to collectivise to do this. And I suppose it's a gauntlet to all of the academics in the room to find a community to feed that information to that enables them not just to have a support group about feeling good about changing a light bulb, but to actually having a support group about making really radical change, whether it's a radical number or radical change.
Thanks, thank you. Okay, and then just staying on that side, can we go to the back corner and then yep, can you see?
Yeah, Andy Middleton, Natural Resources as well. Just picking up on the last comment, a rhetorical question to ask, bearing in mind how few solutions have been talked about here, which is why Neil's was so great, who do you need in the room next time round?
Okay,
and how do we get them here to hear what can be done and share stories of practical change, not ideas about that might lead to it?
Okay, thank you. And then I'll take just one more because there's a hand on the back row there, Jace. Yep.
Thanks. Following up on the question about radical, which is clearly the eye-catching word in the title of the conference, and yet seems to mean different things to different people. Could I ask the 4 people on the panel maybe just to start trying to clarify things by giving a score of 0 to 5, how radical they think they are, how radical they think this conference is, and how radical we need to be.
Okay, so you don't feel obliged to reply. Some of them are just comments, but if there's something you would like to comment back on, very brief comments would be welcome.
Just one thing. This thing about radical. I mean, what we want is change to happen. Whether or not you see these things as being radical or not, now I've argued for a very substantial counter-cyclical investment in transforming the economy to be green, which would, we believe, lead to radical emissions reductions. It would also create loads of jobs. It would give people warm homes. It would insulate us from energy shocks and price shocks. And give us greater energy security as well. Now, it's radical on one hand. On the other hand, does it have to scare people? Hey, it sounds pretty attractive to me. Let's take another one. The reduction in the social norm of the working week to 3 days. That's something else that we've argued for. Hands up here who would like to have the words carved on their gravestones, "I wish I'd spent more time at the office." not many. Okay, it's a pretty radical measure. Doesn't need to scare the horses. I think we're in a position where if we can get the platforms and get the messages across, we have got some win-win-wins. Let's look for things which work. Let's look for things which appeal to people. Anyway, let's not mark ourselves out as sort of some crazy radicals just for the sake of it, just because we get off on the thought of I can be more radical than you. I'm interested in things which are going to work, which are going to lead to deep change and re-engineering of the economy and probably our lifestyles as well, but ones which I think are going to make life better.
Okay, thanks. Any more, Kevin Johnson?
Yeah. I think as academics, those of us that are academics have to be quite careful here. We might have our own view as to how we would like to see the world to be. And certainly I have one, I'm sure we all have one, but that's not our job as academics. That's our job as citizens to drive that forward. So our job as academics, in this case, is to be, to those of us that are employed looking at issues of climate change, is to respond to the challenges of climate change that society has set for us. And in that sense, we just have to, I'm not interested whether we have to have radical means to bring about the change. We need to have radical reductions to meet the targets that society has set us. So it's the targets or the rates of reductions that are actually radical, not necessarily the means. As it turns out, it looks like the means will have to be radical to deliver those reductions, and they will have social repercussions. But that's not necessarily our job as academics to say whether they are necessarily good or bad. But actually, I'd like to step back from all that and say that what we're talking about here is actually not having a radical future. The whole point of discussing being radical is to avoid being radical. The radical that we're trying to avoid are the changes to the climate. We're not here because we want to pay our mortgages. Well, maybe a few of us are, but we're not here because we want to pay our mortgages. We're here because we're trying to do something worthwhile to stop the future being a radical place where people will struggle to live and ecosystems will struggle to carry on evolving. And that's the radical future we're trying to avoid. So the most dangerous radical future is the status quo. Actually, we live in a world, in the West particularly, where we think of the future just being the same as the present, and it's not. That mindset is radical, to actually think like that, to be as placid as a lot of government is, and in fact a lot of us are. Well, I'll make that comment a few minutes from now actually. I think that is radical, to think that is okay to do that. So we're looking at what are short-term radical changes to try to avoid a long-term radical and undesirable future.
Corin, do you want to
Yeah, just very briefly, I wasn't really thinking about the next conference right away. The way this conference came is Kevin was actually complaining to us at the Tyndall Center in an assembly to say, well, we cannot meet the 2-degree target, or we can, but it's really going to be very difficult. We need very radical changes, and the whole thing became a bit unrealistic. And I actually became more hopeful with these 2 days actually to hear that radical emission reduction is realistic. What is difficult to achieve is scale, and that makes it on the realm of we had a scale up on the screen today about what was it, impossible, and then radical, and then acceptable, and then it went on and on and on. And I think that, I don't know what the next conference is going to look like, if there is a next conference, but I think that we have moved forward with this conference, and part of it was to have such a varied group of people in the audience. We haven't, each of us, had the whole, perhaps, spectrum of information and exchange that we would have liked to have, but in exchange we had quite a lot, I think, actually personally, that I was not expecting to receive from this conference.
Caroline?
Just to say that I think one of the things that I've welcomed from it has been precisely the kind of multidisciplinaryness of it, and in terms of what's radical, then, you know, to my mind, I mean, I was just trying to touch on it briefly in my notes, but the idea that we cannot go on having an economy that just goes on growing and growing and growing. Actually, when you start to think about what a steady-state economy might look like, and the implications then for the number of hours we work, what we're doing when we are working, what the very definition of work is, actually all comes into play. So to my mind, that is relatively radical. But again, I don't want to position radical as a term that has to mean scary and off-putting. You know, I think somebody who, for the first time, gets an allotment and starts growing their own food, in a way, that's quite a radical thing to do. It's saying I don't need to be dependent on food prices in the high streets. I can actually begin to build my own community and my own production and consumption patterns. So I think part of actions being radical is the kind of the motivation, as well as the actual what the act itself looks like.
Just very quickly, remember that the conference was made up out of the submissions that were submitted to us. So we were as open as we could be. We actually went out and tried to chase people up outside of universities to come along and say, well, what are they doing? So actually, this is perhaps a reflection of that we haven't gone very far on radical things so far. So there aren't that many radical examples out there. We've seen a few, and we've seen some prospects, but that's because they probably don't exist. So if we hold one again, maybe we'll have more examples by then. But this is, I think, probably a straw poll, given the abstracts that we got of where we are on trying to make these sorts of rates of change. We're just touching on it at the moment.
Okay, another wave of questions. I'm moving to the back left quadrant now to save the arms of people who were in the right quadrant before. Yep, so right at the back.
Thanks. Stuart Capstick, Cardiff University. I wanted to ask about something which has kind of been touched on a couple of times in this conference, but I don't think we've really got our teeth into it. And that's the place of direct action or civil disobedience. And I wanted to ask the panel whether they view this as an important part of a radical plan for emissions reduction. And more specifically, and I might know Caroline's answer to this, but more specifically, are they supportive of the blockades of fracking sites which are going on at the moment and have been going on this year and will be going on in the future?
Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll take a few more, please. So, lady on the aisle, please. Yep.
Yeah, so Fahani, I'm from Chatham House. One thing I would suggest for a repeat of this conference, and very soon, given that the urgency issue is there, is that maybe we try more actively to engage the Global South. And first of all, we should probably offer them an apology, because they have been asking for lifestyle changes, consumption-based approaches, and all the things basically that were discussed at this conference. They have been putting that forward for about 25 years. So we've sort of slightly caught up. And there's much more synergies there than I think have been explored in these 2 days. And I think that there's a real global moment that could happen if we were to now reach out and start looking at some of the old proposals that were on the table and why they got shoved to the side, why we, as researchers, excluded them because they were too shocking, too difficult, and we all went down a different route. So there's a little bit of maybe humility and a little bit of a reflective moment that needs to happen. And I would be interested to know if there could be a way to do that, because a lot of those people are out there really engaged in radical political struggles, very difficult political struggles. And I think they are unlikely to submit an abstract, but they would be part of this conversation.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so can we go, there's sort of, for me it looks like there's 3 in a line, but yeah, that's good.
Hi, thank you, yes. Mark Bigland-Pritchard. I feel that I'm here, well, firstly, I'd like to thank you actually for organising a conference that's so diverse in the number of the people who are here, and so inspiring in terms of, you know, actually there's this many people who care this much. You know, we need the whole world, but at least there's this many. But I'm here, I feel, on behalf of a community which is vitally important to this process, but which hasn't had a lot of airtime, and that's the grassroots activist community. I live in a part of the world which actually the economy is structured very, very differently from here. I'm from Saskatchewan in Canada. Although I don't sound like it. We have a per capita emissions figure of about 70 tonnes per person per year in the province. About 3/4 of that is in the production of raw materials to export out of the province. So we're in a very different situation from some of the things that have been talked about. So one point I'd like you to know, if you're doing this again, maybe you could internationalize it a little bit more. I didn't hear about this until quite late on. But my questions are twofold. One is to Caroline, and that is, speaking from the activist community, what can we do to help politicians to stand firm, to develop some courage, those that have, where the penny has dropped but they're not actually doing this about it.
Okay, and
what can we do? And the second question is to the academics here, what are you going to do to support the grassroots activist community?
Okay, thank you. I'll take 2 more in this tranche. So this, the waving, yes.
Sally Weintraub. I wanted just to bring in time, because looking at that heading, the heading of the title of the conference, time is lurking behind it, and we keep returning to the question of time. It's urgent, and it's an issue. So I just wanted to bring in one psychological observation about time, which is that I think that with the expansionist, we can have everything, opening horizons, there are no limits and no, it goes on forever, sort of state of mind that we are all as human beings subject to, starts with the baby at the breast, if you like. It's all for me and it's endless, this sort of state of mind that has become in our political structures now in this dangerous way that we've been talking about for 2 days now. What happens is that there is all the time in the world. There is a huge distortion of the very understanding of what time is about. And I think it is that introduces this weird situation where we're all saying it's so urgent, and yet there's this other structure which is time is endless, and it's a fantasy. And I want to make it personal, but I want to make it personal because I think, it applies to me. I'm not just laying it at the floor of governments and this, that, and the other. I know myself that it's almost like an addict who will say, yes, I'm going to do it tomorrow. And I think I'm profoundly grateful for this conference. I think we're getting the confidence to actually come together and say there is a future, we can see it, we can actually live it, and we need to live it now. And so the now becomes the question of when am I going to get real about time?
Okay,
and I just wanted to bring that in.
Thank you. And could you just pass the mic behind you? Okay, and then this will be the last one for this.
Hi, I'm Pedro from Thinker's Bubble. Mine kind of follows on from yours. There's been a lot of talk over the last couple of days about the need for changes to the infrastructure and the need for us to persuade the government to tell us to stop consuming. But in actual fact, there's nothing to stop us from reducing our emissions. I know this because I've already done it. I came down from 10 tonnes to 2 tonnes overnight. And then after I moved to Tinker's Bubble, I reduced that down half again, and I'm working on the last tonne. That's harder to do, but there's nothing stopping us, any of us doing it. Mine might not be the example for everyone, but everyone should be setting their example. Everyone should be showing a way. There's nothing to stop you doing it. Most of our emissions are discretionary, and we can do that. And then we can ask the politicians for the revolution we want. We can show them the example of how we want that future to be.
Thank you very much. Okay, so if our panellists would like to briefly pick up any of the points that they would like, so there's still a lot of hands out there that they want to say something. So I'll go in reverse order this time.
Well, the last contribution was incredibly inspiring, and it's brilliant. But if that's the model, if we've got to wait till everybody's done that before they then ask the government to put in place the enabling policy framework we need to enable everybody to do it, or to compel them to do it, or to make it cheaper and more effective to do it, then, we haven't, going back to what Sally said, but we don't actually have that time, I don't think. I'm sorry but I believe that. So it seems to me that we do need and welcome, and the positive example of people being willing to do that is incredibly inspiring to everybody, but also to politicians, because it means that they then will hopefully be a little braver when it comes to moving in the direction of that policy framework. But it just worries me if we take away the policy angle of it, the idea that individual action on its own is going to add up to enough in time, because unfortunately there are a hell of a lot more people out there than there are in here. In terms of what people can do to help MPs stand firm, partly it is the kind of boring stuff that no doubt you already do, the lobbying, the demonstrations, the pressure that you can bring to bear to let MPs know that you care about an issue. At the end of the day, they want to get re-elected, and as long as you can be clear that this is an integral election issue for you, then to some extent you've got leverage with them. But I would urge you again to look at this gagging bill if you didn't already know about it, if you haven't already mobilised around it, because it really is the biggest threat to any kind of civil society action we might like to see in the future, the grassroots mobilisation and everything else. If that's going to include a kind of lobbying angle to it, then it's seriously at threat as a result of this new piece of legislation, and there's been so little coverage of it. I was asked about position on peaceful direct action, and I think it's pretty obvious since I've got a trial in March for having been blockading the fracking site at Bolcombe, where my position is. But I think the point is that it's not an end in itself. It's one of the tools in the toolbox, and I think what I found came out of that particular process was that there were so many people who were taking action in Bolcombe for the very first time, saying that they've never taken any kind of action, not even written to an MP before, yet here they were actually, sitting down blockading the site of the fracking, the fracking place, and that was waking them up. It was reaching a whole new set of people and making people realise that the seriousness of what's at stake. So I think if there's a strategy behind it, then it's absolutely a positive element of our overall democracy, and again something that we need to protect, because there's plenty of processes that the government's putting in place to try to shut down the space for political action. And I guess
can I move on?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll be just very brief about what the academics community can do to support other movements. Actually, I think that the academic community is an entity in itself. It's very important that we have a strong voice. It was mentioned a couple of times in this conference that evidence, continue to value evidence, provide clear numbers, and very, very importantly, provide the evidence and the numbers that are needed, and not provide the ones that we sort of happens to stumble on, or that we're interested in our own academic circles. I think it's very important that the academic community comes out of the box and goes to talk to policymakers, goes to talk to businesses, talk to groups and alliances that actually are interested and needed information, and works with us in the community and vice versa to make our messages more relevant. Engage the Global South, very, very, very important. We do not want to stick ourselves outside of the emissions in the past are historically a burden of rich countries, but as we progress towards the future, we have to find solutions that are suitable for everybody, and that has to come with dialogues, with concerns of everybody, and with an acknowledgements of justice and historical responsibility.
On the civil disobedience question, I've got sort of two responses to that. One, as a citizen, I'm all for and in favour of people using whatever means that they would like to use at their disposal that are non-violent to bring about change. I may disagree with a lot of what they decide to do sometimes, but I think it is appropriate in a thriving democracy that we have that capacity and ability to do that. I would have sort of slightly though turned it on its head as an academic. And that's a citizen. As an academic, I sort of have to stand outside. I have chosen to decide to stand outside the idea of civil disobedience, though I wish there were many more James Hansons actually out there. But actually, I'd turn it completely on its head and say civil disobedience is doing what we're doing. You know, if it's the word civil disobedience against any reasonable moral code, what we are doing with our emissions is civil disobedience. So the law-abiding citizens that live happily in our semi-detached homes at night, that is civil disobedience as we sit watching TV, not caring about what we are doing to the poorer parts of the world in particular, or caring about the future. That is civil disobedience, even if we're doing it quietly from our sofa with a remote control. So I think the real civil disobedience is again the status quo. In relation to the Global South, the reason we had this event actually, my view of why we had this event is because I think we need to turn around and say if we do go, I'm trying to park some of the philosophical discussions we've had over the last few days now, if we do go ahead and say we have a certain carbon budget to spend, the first thing we should ask about, who wants the largest part of that cake? Who should have the largest part of that cake? My response to that would be the Global South, not the other way around. And when you say the Global South should have the largest part of the cake, then we should ask in the rich part of the world, what's left for us? And then we just get the crumbs that are left, and that seems to me completely appropriate. When you get the crumbs that are left, that leads you to the bit of the carbon budget you have, and that's where you need radical change. So the radical change we're discussing here are the radical changes that need to occur in the wealthy parts of the world for the poor parts of the world to have their appropriate part of the carbon budget cake. So I think we are hopefully responding in perhaps a roundabout way to the concerns about the Global South. And then about the grassroots and activists and so forth. Well, Caroline might be in the dock and she might be having to spend a few nights in cells. We'll see what happens. But on the Monday of that week when she'll be in dock, I'll probably be in court, not defending her, but actually discussing the issues of climate change and whether in fact the development of shale gas in the UK is compatible with the UK government's obligations on climate change, and trying to suggest that they're not. So as academics, we can defend the rigour and the scientific principles that the courts, I think, in the end should use when deciding whether Caroline is innocent or guilty.
Okay.
I just wrap a couple of the questions together. I work for an organisation called Global Witness. We work with communities in the Global South who are on the front line of what you would know as the resource curse, where through the exploitation of natural resources, local communities are supposed to benefit, and actually usually what happens is entirely the opposite. Their communities get trashed, their watercourses get polluted, violence breaks out, and societies break down. In those circumstances, you find people who step up as guardians of their natural resources, whether it's forests, whether it's land, and put their lives on the line in order to preserve the conditions of their own livelihoods, and get killed in the process. And we produced a report on environmental and land defenders last year, which is for the first time attempting to track this. Now, the reason I find this interesting is because if you stand up and act in a civilly disobedient way, or in terms of non-violent direct action on an issue like fracking in this country, you're branded an enemy of development. When in fact it's people who are doing exactly this kind of thing around the world who are standing up for development, standing up for real development, a compact with our natural resources which allows people to meet their needs. And I think we're going to see much more of these kind of confrontations when people do put themselves on the line, and will have to put themselves on the line, because when you have authority acting in a system to preserve the system as it is, some kind of disobedience, sooner or later, becomes an essential part of the process.
Okay, I'm going to take a few more. Okay, so if our running mics could come towards the front. Okay, so this right at the front. Rachel, did you have your hand up? No, yeah.
Rachel Lauren at the Tyndall Centre, UEA. I have three suggestions to make. So the first is actually something that academics like myself can do. It's a suggestion for how to get more people engaged with climate change, in particular those people who perhaps have been rather turned off the issue. And that's to reach out to the many people, politicians included, who probably think that food security and water security are more important than climate change. Those people need to understand the very significant way in which climate change compromises future food security and future water security. If we look at a 4 degrees or more warming, which is what we appear to be headed for right now, there are enormous implications for food and water security. We really need to get that out there. Now I'm going to move on to something that
Okay, a little bit quicker, Rachel.
I'm less
radical.
Okay, I'm less sure how to do this, but we need to try to influence people who are related to two really big things that influence the global economy. There is a way in which we all contribute to carbon emissions that hasn't been talked about directly in that way. It's the way we all indirectly contribute to climate change through our pension funds. So we either choose a pension fund or our employer does, which then probably gives money to the fossil fuel industry. How do we address that? We've discussed it a bit, but it's something that we could all personally perhaps influence.
Okay, and the third one
The
quickly?
third point is about the WTO. It appears that it could completely compromise the efforts of the UNFCCC by making it illegal to block the extraction of further fossil fuels from certain places. We have to address that. We have to engage with the people from the UK who are going to the WTO.
Okay, great, thank you. And I'm very sorry to say, because I can see all the hands, this is the last question on the side there. Yeah, that's just, no, sorry.
Thank you. My name is Niklas Hellström from Sweden, What Next? And thanks again for this fabulous conference. I think in talking about this search for real concrete ideas for solutions and struggling with this kind of recognition of the need for local based development, community development, the global south, and really community power. At the same time as seeing the sort of emissions curve reductions, budget, the kind of sheer scope of things and the time constraint. How do we couple these together in a way that actually makes sense and can deliver? And that's something I'm really struggling with. And I just want to kind of alert you on one idea that has beginning to get some considerable traction also within the negotiation spaces, which is the idea of globally funded feed-in tariffs as a sort of public investment scheme of sort of global Marshall Plan scope to enable communities in the South to do decentralized off-grid, community-based cooperative systems of renewable energy to cater to energy access as much as mitigation and avoided emissions, funded by the North, which over time would also press down the sort of costs also for us, so it's sort of also in our own interests. There's much to say about this. I think there's a million traps, of course, as always. How do you get the right technologies? How do you actually get real community involvement, etc.? But it has some promises, and I just invite you to engage and comment and see what might happen over the coming year, even in terms of this idea moving. There is some in this book that you might have seen. You can pick up a copy otherwise.
Thank you.
More elaborated. Thanks.
Thank you. If there's anything, they were more commenty than questioning, but if there's anything you'd like to pick up briefly, you happy? So I'll hand over to Kevin now, who has...
Can I interrupt? I've just got 2 quick questions to ask, not of the panel, but of the audience. It'll take me no more than 1 minute. Please let me do so.
Oh, go on then. But I am timing you, and it is literally 1 minute. I will stop you talking. Okay? Okay, hang on. You do need a microphone though.
We've had for 2 days. What I want to do is effectively to see the switch between the sheep and the goats. How many of you, hands up, those of you who believe that we can indeed globally restrict the temperature to no more than 10 degrees above pre-industrial 2 degrees, and bear in mind that 2 degrees
is that the question? Let's have some audience participation.
2
Who believes
degrees
it?
is an average rate.
That we could do it.
And the second point is, and it is really important, is how many hands up those of you who believe that the essential reduction in carbon emissions can be achieved on a voluntary basis rather than imposed as a mandatory requirement.
Can it be done on a voluntary basis? Okay. Mayor won me over there with a bit of audience participation, but I will hand over now to Kevin to do his wrap-up, because he hasn't done that yet, and also to close the conference.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Carly. I won't be anywhere near as eloquent as my colleagues here, but I just want to say that I've learned a lot, and I hope you all have learned a lot from the wealth and diversity of presentations over the last 2 days. Probably more important than that, I think, is I'm hoping that it's opened up a space where we can start to question the current paradigm or current paradigms and come up with alternatives. And that's quite a difficult challenge for us, I think, to question the status quo. And at least when you get people who are prepared to do that together, that gives us that space to do it, and maybe that bit of courage that we sometimes need to say the things that we think but then say. And I do think we're all in that way constrained all the time, and this space actually has opened that up to us. On reflection, I almost wish we'd turned the days round, that we had a lot more of the sort of can-do things today, and yesterday we had the things that were the sort of the bigger challenges. And actually, I think if we'd switched it round and had the can-do things, and then today could have been, well, actually, we've seen you can do them. How do you go about delivering them? I think would have, as it turns out, I think would have been a better way of scaling it going forward, and we've learned that for next time. But in terms of the can-do bits that were really uplifting, I mean, we can-do cars, can-do shipping. These are all things that can-do lighting, and actually Brenda made the point that the small is really the big. I quite like that. But also that's the can-do. But there's also the done and doing. Now there weren't many done and doings. We had very few abstracts. But I think there's no way the perfect example of done and doing would be Neil's presentation about the fire, not just the fire station, but the fire brigade and the number of fire brigades in Southern Ireland. I mean that was really incredibly inspiring, and I naively hoped we get more of those, that we would then be able to talk about how do you start to bring them together. But nevertheless, having one as strong as that, I think was really inspiring. But the one that went with that also was Charlie's on retrofit. So these are 2 really important areas of emissions demonstrating you can do these things. At the same time, we had other people on the cars and the shipping showing that actually it's not that hard to deliver what you've managed to deliver on fire brigades and for retrofit to these other sectors as well. And I think actually that was it would have been nice to see how that could have been scaled up further. In terms of my own thoughts about, well, I was thinking about in relation to Charlie's one in particular, and this comes back to the idea of thinking differently about these issues. The government has recently spent gave £350 billion of quantitative easing to the banks. 350 billion, that's roughly a third of our GDP, isn't it? A quarter to a third, is that about right? Something like that. That would have retrofitted about, if you followed Charlie's approach or the Joseph Rowntree approach, that would have retrofitted 17 million homes in the UK. 17 million homes would have been retrofitted for the same amount of money that we gave to the banks to squander or to just sit on. So I think if we're talking about the idea we're short of money, we're short of capital, we're not short of any of those things. We've got plenty of capital in countries like ours. What we are short of is the imagination and the courage to actually put the capital where it needs to be spent to deliver the sorts of things that most of us are quite keen on here. And I'm saying that because it doesn't mean that we can actually start to scale up what we heard about for Ireland, what we heard about from Charlie. We can scale it up to the shipping industry, into the car industry. There's not a capital problem, there's not a technology problem. And it comes back to the point we said earlier, this is actually a political issue at the end of the day. But I don't think it's the politicians' fault. It's, everyone in here is pretty much a policymaker. We're that elite few with nice educations. So we are the policymakers. We have the power, but by and large, I'm not saying it's our particular group here, but it would be many of us in this group. We have the power, but remain silent. I mean, are any of us going to be there? Have any of us written in to say about the fourth carbon budget, trying to support DECC as it's fighting against the Treasury? To have the fourth carbon budgets basically scrapped, and the next election probably DECC scrapped as well. Have any of us got contact about that? No. Are any of us there trying to argue for the EU not having a 40% reduction cap for 2030, when 40% has nothing to do with 2 degrees C? No, we're not. We stay quiet. So we can blame the policymakers, but our silence is deafening, particularly as an academic community. So I think that the problems are political, but we are those policymakers, and it's incumbent now on us to start to make those changes. And actually building on Naomi's comment that change is a popular thing, but most people who want change, though it's very popular, actually don't have much power. Well, if we can ally them with people like us who actually have the power as policymakers, with the people who popularly want that, I think we then start to have enough force to be reckoned with, and BP and Shell and these other companies, we could then start to compete with the sort of lobbying and commercial powers that they have. Because at least in this country, and also, maybe it's different for the States, in this country, every few years, Caroline gets, it can be booted in or booted in, kept in or booted out. People may take this from you, but anyway. So we still have that agency in this country, and yet we're foregoing that. And we can all moan and groan about the Shells and the BPs and the other companies out there, but actually I think it's within our power to make some significant changes to that. And in disagreeing with Brand when he said that idea that we shouldn't be involved in democracy, I sort of take the view, I think actually our fledgling democracy needs to be taken over. We should commandeer it, get it back from the commercial enterprises, and actually reinvigorate it, as someone was talking about before, and take it on. It's our democracy. So don't pretend it doesn't exist. It's there, it's weak, it needs some help. But we're not helping it, we're letting it sit by. So beyond all of that, I'd say, going back to the gentleman's point down here, and Neil's point, but he had one little note on one of his slides that said lead by example. And I think if we as a community could lead by example, actually in our own emissions, as well as actually trying to assert some of our power to make the changes that are necessary and many people apparently desire and want to join us, then I think there is actually some real hope for the future. So that was my sort of summary of the last 2 days. I'm trying to be upbeat because I'm not normally. I'm one of the ones who put my hand up, Mayo. I actually think we can stick to 2 degrees C. If you said, do I think we'll do it? I think we won't do it. But if we don't try, we certainly won't. So I now have the much more exciting task of thanking people. There are far too many thanks to give out, but I'm going to whip through a few here. Firstly, I would like to thank Caroline and Andrew for being on the panel with us today. That's much appreciated, and for your input as well over the last 2 days. I'd like to thank Naomi, who's not there, for an excellent keynote that I think she really did sort of gel together a lot of the discussion that went on throughout yesterday and again through today. And I really look forward to her book next year, and I will email her and thank her from myself and from the Tyndall Centre, but also from all of us. I'd also then like to thank Carly, who stood in unexpectedly has been a wonderful compare. So thanks for all your hard effort, Carly. It's actually very stressful being up here. I think Carly's done a grand job. I'd like to thank Maria, Alfie, Asher and Rita for their various bits of help, and the folk on the mic, Shimfang Jays, Phoebe, Claire, and I'd also very much like to thank John, who has managed, with Alfie, has managed to hold the technology together. What John has actually managed to do is save many, probably tens of tons of CO2. So that's quite an achievement. So I'd like to thanks very much for that, John. I'd also like to thank B. I don't know if B's here, but B, who's really very significantly helped pull this conference together. And I'd like to thank, if he's up there, Joaquin. Are you there? Well, yep, away from the back. And who's been our sound man, and he's been really helpful. So, in combined with John, that's how come we've managed to be able to hear the people from all around the world. So I'd like to thank all of those people. I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us on the live stream views, and all the tweeters. Thank you, live streamers down there. I'd like to thank all the speakers, and I'd like to thank all the delegates. It's been an inspiring conference. There's a long way to go. It's the start of a radical movement. I hope we've actually opened up a space, as I said before, to discuss these issues. And then maybe we've developed the signs of a community where we can start to thrash these ideas out, because clearly we have different ideas as to what this radical future might end up looking like. I think, did you mention the special issue? You have done or not?
I haven't.
Oh,
so
you
if
haven't?
you
Okay.
want to be part of the special issue, please make sure you have emailed B. Jefferson by this Friday. And the deadline is the 23rd?
28th.
28th.
February.
We've got a whole extra 5 days. 28th.
No. February.
February.
For submission. So
Yeah.
you let know B by Friday.
And then
if you are going
28th
to
of
submit.
February for submission.
Okay. And I think on that note, I'd like to wish you all safe travels home, hopefully by very low carbon means. And we will try to put, I think most of the presentations will go up at some point on the Tyndall Centre website, and watch that space for any follow-up from today's event. So thank you very much all for coming along.
Okay, there's tea and coffee at the back now if you want a refreshment before you go.
Posters available in the far room.
And the posters are available in the far room. They've been taken down, but if you go through the back and to the right, you'll get the posters.
There's recycling sacks, red sacks at the registration desk.
And there are red sacks at registration desk for any unwanted paper.